Roman galley slaves weren't actually slaves. That Hollywood image you have? Completely wrong. The truth about who really powered these ancient warships will shatter everything you thought you knew about Roman naval warfare. But here's what's even more surprising. The real conditions were somehow both better and infinitely worse than fiction portrays. Freedom could vanish in a heartbeat. One moment you're tending sheep in a quiet coastal village, the next you're bound in chains heading toward a nightmare that might last decades. Galley slavery didn't discriminate. It grabbed whoever was unlucky enough to be in the wrong place when raiders struck. Corsairs from North Africa swept down on European coastal towns like wolves hunting sheep. These weren't random attacks either. They planned their raids carefully, studying which villages had the weakest defenses and the most able-bodied men. Young fishermen mending nets by the harbor made perfect targets. So did farmers working fields near the shore. The raiders wanted strong backs and working hands, not old men or small children. But pirates weren't the only source of galley slaves. Courts across Europe sentenced criminals to the oars as punishment for theft, desertion, or debt. A man who stole bread to feed his family might find himself chained to a rowing bench for 5 years. Deserters from the army faced even worse, sometimes life sentences pulling those massive oars until their bodies gave out completely. Then there were prisoners of war. When Christian and Muslim fleets clashed in the Mediterranean, the losers didn't get sent to comfortable prison camps. They got dragged straight to the slave markets or pressed into service on enemy galleys. Victory meant freedom, defeat meant chains. Makes sense in a brutal sort of way, right? The slave trade created its own twisted economy. Professional kidnappers worked the coastlines like traveling salesmen, except their product was human misery. They knew exactly which young men would fetch the best prices at the slave auctions. A skilled blacksmith brought more money than a simple laborer. Sailors were especially valuable because they already knew their way around ships. Well, geography played a cruel role too. Villages along the Barbary coast of North Africa supplied countless slaves to Christian galleys. Meanwhile, European coastal towns fed the Muslim fleets with fresh captives. The irony cuts deep. Christians and Muslims enslaving each other with equal enthusiasm, all in the name of their supposedly merciful gods. Some slaves came from surprising places. Venetian merchants occasionally sold their own countrymen into galley service to settle business disputes. Corrupt officials took bribes to look the other way when slave traders operated in their territories. Even family members sometimes sold relatives who'd become financial burdens. Desperation makes people do terrible things. The weird part is how suddenly it could all happen. A young man might wake up planning his wedding, then find himself in chains before sunset. Raiders struck during harvest festivals when entire villages gathered in one place. They hit coastal churches during Sunday services. They ambushed wedding parties and funeral processions. No occasion was too sacred to interrupt for a good slave raid. Soldiers weren't safe either. Entire military units got overwhelmed and marched off to the galleys. These men had trained for battle, but they hadn't prepared for the particular horror of being chained to an oar for years on end. Their military discipline sometimes helped them survive the ordeal, but it also made them valuable to galley captains who appreciated men who could follow orders without question. Let's not forget the children who grew up knowing they'd probably end up at the oars. Sons of galley slaves often inherited their father's fate. Some Mediterranean communities paid annual tributes in young men to avoid having their towns raided. Imagine being the unlucky teenager chosen by lottery to fulfill your village's quota of galley slaves. Economic desperation drove some men to volunteer for galley service. That sounds insane until you consider the alternatives: starvation, debtor's prison, or execution. At least galley slaves got fed, even if the food was terrible. Some volunteers hoped to work off their debts and eventually buy their freedom. Most discovered too late that galley captains weren't particularly interested in honoring such arrangements. The supply of fresh slaves seemed endless. Every military campaign, every coastal raid, every court session added new names to the rowing benches. Ship captains developed preferences for slaves from certain regions. Some swore that mountain men had more endurance than city dwellers. Others claimed that fishermen adapted faster to life at sea, even chained life. Disease and exhaustion meant galleys constantly needed replacement rowers. Death rates were so high that slave merchants built their entire business model around rapid turnover. They didn't expect slaves to live long enough to become expensive long-term investments. And the weird part is, this system worked for centuries. It kept Mediterranean fleets moving when wind power wasn't reliable enough for military operations. But the human cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of men disappeared into this brutal machine of maritime warfare. The moment of capture marked the end of one life, and the beginning of something that could barely be called living. What happened next? The journey from free man to galley slave was just as horrifying as you'd expect. The capture was just the beginning. What happened next turned ordinary people into property in the most literal sense possible. Heavy iron shackles clamped around ankles with a finality that echoed through bone. The metal was rough, unfinished, designed for function rather than comfort. Within hours, the constant rubbing would create raw, bleeding wounds that never quite healed. Wrists received similar treatment, though sometimes captors used rope instead, not out of mercy, but because iron was expensive. The march to the port began immediately. No time to say goodbye, no chance to grab belongings. Guards prodded prisoners forward with spears and clubs, establishing a rhythm that would define the next phase of their lives. Step, shuffle, clank. The sound of dozens of chained feet created its own miserable music. These weren't professional soldiers leading the march. Many guards were little more than hired thugs. Some enjoyed their work too much, laughing at stumbles and falls. Others remained grimly professional, understanding that damaged goods brought lower prices at market. The smart captives quickly learned which type of guard they were dealing with, and adjusted their behavior accordingly. The weight of the chains surprised everyone at first. Iron links designed to hold grown men weren't light, and carrying that extra burden while walking mile after mile drained energy fast. Feet that weren't used to such loads began to swell and blister. The lucky ones had been wearing decent shoes when captured. Everyone else faced the march barefoot across rough roads, sharp stones and whatever debris lined the path to the coast. Water breaks came rarely and lasted only minutes. Guards distributed stale bread when they remembered, which wasn't often. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, though some guards certainly enjoyed the power. Mostly it was simple economics. Why waste good food on people who might not survive the journey anyway? Then there were the sounds that grew louder with each passing hour. First came the distant cry of seagulls, an almost cheerful noise that felt completely wrong given the circumstances. Next, the creaking of wooden wheels and the shouts of merchants hawking their wares. The smell of salt air mixed with fish, tar, and human waste created a distinctive harbor perfume that hit long before the port came into view. The psychological impact of hearing civilization was brutal. Somewhere beyond their line of sight, normal people were conducting normal business. Buying food, greeting friends, complaining about the weather. Life continued as if nothing had happened, while the chained prisoners shuffled toward a fate that felt increasingly real with every step. Guards became more alert as they approached the port. Escape attempts happened most often near populated areas where prisoners might find help or places to hide. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Surrounded by people, yet completely isolated from human kindness or assistance. Local residents had learned to look away when slave columns passed through. Getting involved meant trouble with powerful interests that controlled the galley trade. Some prisoners still harbored hopes of rescue during these final miles. Maybe family members had noticed their absence and organized a search party. Perhaps local authorities would intervene on moral grounds. These hopes died quickly when they saw how casually townspeople ignored their plight. The march continued without interruption, and the sounds of normal life gradually gave way to the specific noises of maritime commerce. Wooden masts appeared first, rising like a forest of dead trees against the sky. The forest grew thicker and more detailed as the column approached the harbor proper. Ships of all sizes bobbed at anchor. Merchant vessels, fishing boats, warships, and yes, galleys. Even from a distance the galleys looked different. Lower in the water, longer than seemed practical, with those distinctive rows of oar ports running along each side. The closer they got, the more real everything became. Guards began pointing towards specific vessels, making crude jokes about which ship would claim which prisoners. Some captives tried to spot potential escape routes, though the heavy chains made any quick movement impossible. Others focused on memorizing faces, perhaps hoping to identify their captors later, if freedom ever returned. Harbor smells intensified with proximity. Rotting fish, human waste, coal smoke from cooking fires, and something else. A deeper, more persistent odor that seemed to emanate from the galleys themselves. It was the smell of fear, sweat, and despair that had soaked into wooden planks over years of use. Even prisoners who had never seen a galley before instinctively understood what that smell meant. The final approach brought everything into sharp focus. Those weren't just ships waiting at anchor. They were floating prisons about to become home for the foreseeable future. The march was ending, but something far worse was about to begin. But first there was the matter of actually seeing these vessels up close. The first thing that hit you wasn't what you saw, it was what you smelled. That mixture of human sweat, pine tar, and salt water created a stench so thick you could practically taste it. And that smell? It never left these ships, ever. Walking closer to the galley while still in chains, most slaves got their first real look at what would become their floating prison. These weren't the massive sailing ships you might think of from pirate movies. Galleys were built for one purpose: speed through human power. They sat low in the water, impossibly long and narrow. Picture a giant wooden centipede lying on its side. The entire design screamed efficiency over comfort. The oars jutting out from both sides made the whole thing look alive somehow. Dozens of them, each one longer than most people's houses, extending into the water like the legs of some sea monster. 45 feet long and heavy enough that it took 6 men just to pull one through the water. When you realized you'd be gripping one of those oars soon, your stomach probably dropped. But here's what really got to new slaves: the noise. Even when docked, these ships buzzed with constant activity. Guards shouted orders in multiple languages. Chains clinked and rattled as existing rowers shifted on their benches. Wooden planks creaked under the weight of supplies being loaded. The whole thing felt like stepping into a hive of angry wasps. Then there were the faces staring back at you through the oar ports, hollow eyes belonging to men who'd already been broken by months or years at the benches. Some had given up hope entirely and just stared blankly. Others still had enough fight left to look curious about the new arrivals. Their skin was burned dark by sun and salt, making them look decades older than they probably were. The deck itself told its own story. Dark stains that couldn't quite be scrubbed away, marked where blood had been spilled during punishments or battles. Grooves worn smooth by countless feet showed the patrol routes of guards who walked back and forth, whips always ready. Everything was built for function, not comfort. Most galleys held around 150 rowers, though some of the larger ones packed in even more. The math was simple but terrifying. More oars meant more speed, and more speed meant better chances in battle or chase. Nobody cared if the rowers had enough room to breathe properly. Looking down through the gratings into the lower deck revealed the true horror. Rows upon rows of wooden benches, each one designed to cram in as many bodies as possible. 5 grown men sharing space meant for maybe 3. The ceiling was so low that standing upright was impossible in most spots. This wasn't just a workplace, it was a tomb for the living. The smell got worse the closer you got to those oar ports. Months of unwashed bodies, human waste, rotting food, and seawater created an atmosphere that burned your nose and throat. Some new slaves actually vomited right there on the dock. Can't really blame them. What struck many prisoners was how organized everything appeared. Every rope had its place, every tool was secured and ready. The guards moved with practiced efficiency, like they'd done this thousands of times before, because they had. This wasn't some rough operation thrown together by amateurs. This was a well-oiled machine designed to extract maximum work from human beings. The galleys also carried the scars of their violent lives: patched holes from cannonballs, splintered wood hastily repaired after ramming enemy ships, burns from fire arrows that had found their mark. These ships weren't just transportation, they were weapons of war, and everyone on board was expendable. Some prisoners noticed the religious symbols carved or painted on various surfaces: crosses, saints, prayers in Latin. The irony wasn't lost on most slaves. Here were Christian symbols decorating ships powered by human misery. Well, nobody said religion always made people nicer. The worst part might have been how normal it all seemed to everyone else. Dock workers loaded supplies without giving the chained men a second glance. Local merchants haggled over prices just yards away from human suffering. Guards joked and laughed while inspecting their future victims. This was just another day at the harbor. But perhaps most chilling was the efficiency of it all. No wasted motion, no unnecessary delays. The whole system was designed to process human beings like cargo. Get them chained, get them rowing, get the ship moving. The faster the better, standing there in chains, staring at your future home. You probably wondered how long you could survive in that floating hell. The answer depended on factors you couldn't control yet. But one thing was certain: those chains around your ankles were about to become much more permanent than you realized. The moment you stepped aboard that galley, your life as a free person ended. Guards grabbed each new slave and dragged them to their assigned bench. There was no ceremony, no explanation, just the cold reality of metal chains being fitted around your ankles. The sound echoed through the ship. Clank, clank, as one by one, men were permanently attached to their rowing positions. These weren't ordinary chains you could slip off when nobody was looking. The iron shackles were custom fitted and then riveted shut right there on the spot. A ship's blacksmith would heat the metal links and hammer them closed around your ankles while you sat helpless on the wooden bench. The process was quick but terrifying. Once those rivets cooled, you weren't going anywhere. Most slaves got ankle chains, but the really troublesome ones, or those the guards just didn't like, received the full treatment. Heavy iron bands went around the waist too, connecting to a central chain that ran along the entire length of the bench. This meant even turning your body became a struggle. Some poor souls were chained at the neck as well, though this was usually reserved for repeat escape artists or anyone who'd caused serious problems during transport. The benches themselves were narrow wooden planks, barely wide enough for a grown man to sit. Yet 5 or 6 slaves were crammed onto each one, shoulder to shoulder, with their chains interlinked. Personal space. Forget about it. Your leg pressed against the next guy's leg, and his against the next. Privacy became a foreign concept the moment those shackles clicked shut. Standing up was impossible, even if you wanted to. The chains were measured precisely to keep you seated with just enough slack to lean forward for rowing. You could shift slightly from side to side, maybe stretch your arms above your head if you were lucky, but that was it. Walking around the ship to stretch your legs or get some fresh air, not happening. Sleep presented its own special torture. While free people could toss and turn in bed, galley slaves learned to sleep sitting upright with their backs against the bench or the person behind them. The chains cut into your ankles if you moved wrong during the night. Many slaves developed permanent marks and scars from the constant rubbing of iron against skin. Then there's the psychological impact of being chained. Humans aren't meant to be tethered like animals, and the mental strain was enormous. Some new slaves would panic, pulling frantically at their chains until their ankles bled. Others fell into deep depression, staring blankly at the oar in front of them for hours. The chains weren't just physical restraints, they were constant reminders that you no longer controlled your own body. Bathroom breaks became a humiliating ordeal. Since nobody could walk to a proper facility, slaves had to relieve themselves right at their bench. Clay pots were sometimes provided, but often men just had to go where they sat. The smell was overwhelming, especially in the lower decks where ventilation was poor. Guards occasionally threw buckets of seawater to wash away the worst of it, but the stench never really disappeared. The chains also created a strange forced community among the benchmates. If one person needed to shift position, everyone else had to cooperate, or the whole line would be yanked around. Arguments were common, but so was an odd kind of teamwork. You learned to move in sync with your chainmates, almost like a weird dance that nobody wanted to be part of. Escape attempts were almost laughably impossible, even if you somehow managed to break your individual shackles, which required tools nobody had. You'd still be connected to 4 or 5 other men who couldn't break theirs. Some desperate souls tried anyway, usually resulting in severe punishment for the entire bench. Guards made sure everyone knew that one person's escape attempt would bring suffering to all their chainmates. The riveted chains meant there was no key, no lock to pick, no simple mechanism to defeat. Only a blacksmith with proper tools could remove them, and those were closely guarded by the ship's crew. Some slaves spent years plotting elaborate schemes to get near the smith's equipment. But success stories were rarer than honest politicians. Meals, work, sleep, and even death all happened while chained to that bench. The metal became part of your body, a permanent extension that you learned to work around rather than against. New slaves often spent their first weeks testing the chains, looking for weak spots or trying different angles to slip free. Veterans just watched quietly, knowing the newcomers would eventually accept the same harsh reality they had learned. But the chains were just the beginning of the galley slave's nightmare. Being permanently attached to your rowing position was bad enough, yet it was nothing compared to what filled your belly each day. Food on a galley wasn't exactly what you'd call fine dining. The daily meal for a galley slave consisted mainly of black biscuits that were hard enough to break teeth. These weren't the fluffy biscuits your grandmother might make. They were dense, dark chunks of baked flour that had been sitting in storage barrels for months, sometimes years. The stuff was practically indestructible, which made it perfect for long sea voyages, but terrible for anyone who actually had to eat it. Each slave received his portion in the morning, handed out by guards who moved quickly down the benches. No plates, no utensils, just a hard chunk of bread dropped into waiting hands. The biscuits were often crawling with weevils, small beetles that had made themselves at home in the flour. Most slaves learned to ignore the extra protein. What choice did they have? Water came in wooden buckets, shared between several men. The ration was carefully measured, just enough to keep a person alive but never enough to feel satisfied. During hot summer months, this water became precious beyond gold. Guards controlled every drop, and slaves who complained about the taste, which was often stale and brackish, might find their ration reduced the next day. Then there was the bean stew, if you could call it that. This watery concoction appeared maybe once or twice a week, usually when supplies were running low and the ship's cook needed to stretch ingredients. The beans were often partially rotten, floating in a thin broth that had more in common with dishwater than actual soup. But after days of gnawing on rock-hard biscuits, even this miserable stew felt like a feast. The timing of meals followed the ship's routine, not human hunger. Breakfast came at dawn, before the day's rowing began, no lunch. The evening meal arrived after the sun had set, and the oars were finally secured for the night. That meant 12 to 14 hours between eating, while performing back-breaking physical labor. Your stomach would be eating itself by dinner time. Storage was always a problem on these cramped vessels. Food barrels took up valuable space, so captains ordered the cheapest, longest-lasting provisions available. Salted meat appeared occasionally, but it was usually so loaded with salt that it made men desperately thirsty. Not exactly helpful when water was already rationed. The salt pork was often green around the edges and smelled like something that had died weeks ago. Bread that wasn't black biscuit sometimes made an appearance, but it was usually moldy. Green and blue fuzzy spots covered the crusts, and slaves learned to scrape off what they could and eat the rest anyway. Hunger has a way of making people less picky about food quality. Besides, throwing away bread, even moldy bread, could earn a man a beating from the guards. Wine or ale was reserved for the crew and officers. Slaves got water, period. Sometimes this water had been sitting in barrels for so long that it developed a slimy film on top. Other times it tasted strongly of the wooden barrels themselves, mixed with whatever else those barrels had previously held. Could have been wine, could have been oil, could have been something much worse. The cooking facilities on board were basic at best. Most food was prepared in a single large pot over an open fire, when weather permitted. During storms or rough seas, everyone ate cold food or nothing at all. Hot meals were a luxury that depended entirely on calm waters and favorable winds. Rats competed with the slaves for what little food there was. These weren't cute little mice. They were big, aggressive ship rats that had no fear of humans. They chewed through food barrels and contaminated whatever they couldn't eat. Some desperate slaves actually tried to catch and eat the rats, but the creatures were usually too quick and clever. Scurvy became a real problem on longer voyages. Without fresh fruits or vegetables, men's teeth would loosen and their gums would bleed. Strange rashes appeared on their skin. Some died from diseases that could have been prevented with a single orange or lemon. But fresh food spoiled quickly at sea, so it rarely made it into a slave's diet. The guards ate better. Naturally, they had access to cheese, dried fruits, and better cuts of meat. Slaves could smell these superior meals cooking, and watch the crew enjoying food that looked almost edible. The contrast was deliberate. Another way to remind the chained men of their place in the ship's hierarchy. Feast days brought slightly better fare, usually in honor of some religious holiday. But even then, better was relative. Maybe the biscuits were fresher, or the stew had actual chunks of meat floating in it. After months of this diet, men's bodies began breaking down from malnutrition. But hunger was just one part of their misery. The clothes they wore told another story of deprivation and control that went far beyond empty stomachs. After being chained to their rowing benches and given their meager rations, new galley slaves received what passed for a uniform. The word uniform might be generous here. Think more like prison garb, designed by someone who'd never heard of comfort or dignity. Every slave got the same basic outfit, a rough brown tunic that felt like it was woven from tree bark, loose canvas breeches that provided about as much protection as tissue paper, and if they were particularly lucky, a red cap that marked them as property of whichever fleet owned the galley. The brown tunic was deliberately rough, coarse fabric that scratched against skin already raw from chains and salt air. Canvas breeches were practical, sure, but they offered zero protection from splinters, rope burns, or the constant chafing that came with being wedged between other sweating bodies for months at a time. Then there were the shirts, 2 of them, which sounds generous until you realize they were expected to last years. These weren't exactly tailored garments, more like sacks with armholes cut out. The vest was slightly thicker fabric, meant to provide some protection during the worst weather, but it was still rough enough to leave marks on anyone's skin after prolonged wear. The red cap deserves special mention, not because it was particularly well made or comfortable, but because of what it represented. That little piece of red cloth marked every wearer as a galley slave from a distance. No chance of blending into a crowd if you ever made it to shore. No opportunity to pretend you were anything other than what you'd become. The cap was as much a shackle as the iron chains around their ankles. But here's where things get interesting. Shoes were a completely different story. Most slaves never saw a pair during their entire time on the galley. Bare feet were the norm, which made perfect sense from the captain's perspective. Why waste money on footwear for people who were going to spend most of their time sitting at rowing benches? Bare feet also made running away significantly more difficult and painful if anyone ever got the chance to try. The only slaves who received shoes were those selected for shore duty, unloading cargo, carrying supplies or performing maintenance work in port. Even then, the shoes were usually worn-out cast-offs or the cheapest possible leather sandals. Getting selected for shore duty and receiving those precious shoes was like winning a small lottery, except the prize came with armed guards and the constant threat of brutal punishment for any escape attempts. Personal grooming was handled with military efficiency and zero concern for individual preference. Every slave's head was shaved completely bald upon arrival, and regular shaving continued throughout their service. This wasn't about hygiene, though that was certainly a factor. Lice spread quickly in the cramped, filthy conditions below deck. The real reason was prevention of disguise. A shaved head made it impossible for escaped slaves to blend in with local populations. Hair could hide scars, change someone's appearance, make them look like a regular sailor or dock worker instead of escaped galley property. Without hair, every former slave looked exactly like what they were, a marked man who belonged to someone else. Regular shaving also served as a constant reminder of their status. No control over their own appearance, no personal choices, no individual identity beyond their role as human engines. The clothing situation got worse over time, not better. That initial uniform, it had to last. Repairs were done with whatever scraps were available, usually by the slaves themselves during rare moments of downtime. Tunics developed holes that were patched with different colored fabric, creating a patchwork appearance that somehow made the uniform even more degrading. Canvas breeches split at the seams from constant movement and were sewn back together with rough thread that created uncomfortable ridges and bumps. Within weeks of receiving their clothing, most slaves looked like they'd been dressed by someone who hated them, which frankly wasn't far from the truth. Salt water, sweat, and the general filth of galley life turned the brown tunics into stiff, discolored rags that probably could have stood up on their own. The canvas breeches faded to an unidentifiable grey-brown color that matched the hopeless expressions of their wearers. Laundry was essentially non-existent. Clothes were occasionally rinsed with seawater, which removed some of the surface dirt, but left everything stiff with salt and somehow even more uncomfortable than before. Fresh water was too precious to waste on cleaning clothes when it was barely adequate for drinking and cooking. The uniform served its purpose perfectly, marking slaves as property, making escape more difficult, and stripping away any sense of personal identity or dignity. But clothing was just the beginning of their daily struggles. Where and how they slept in those rough garments would prove to be another level of misery entirely. When darkness fell on a galley, the real nightmare began. The rowing stopped, but comfort. That was a luxury these men would never know again. Picture trying to sleep while sitting upright on a wooden bench barely wide enough for 3 people. Now cram 5 grown men onto that same space, their shoulders pressed together like sardines in a tin. Personal space became a forgotten concept from their old lives. The bench felt like sitting on a knife edge after the first hour. By morning, every muscle screamed in protest. Backs curved into unnatural positions as men tried to find some relief against the hard wood. Some leaned forward, resting their heads on their knees. Others tilted sideways against their benchmates. Nobody found a position that didn't hurt. Sleep came in tiny fragments. A man might doze for 20 minutes before cramps woke him up. Then he'd shift positions, disturbing everyone else in the process. The chain around his ankle clinked with every movement. 5 men moving meant constant noise throughout the night. The smell down in the lower galley would knock you flat. Imagine the worst locker room you've ever entered, then multiply that by 100. Sweat, unwashed bodies, human waste, rotting food scraps, and seawater all mixed together in the stagnant air. Fresh air was just a memory from their former lives. Rats scurried between the benches at night. They weren't picky eaters, leftover breadcrumbs, scraps of cloth, sometimes even nibbling on sleeping men's feet. The scratching and squeaking never stopped. Some slaves learned to sleep through it. Others spent their nights kicking at the darkness, hoping to scare the rodents away. Then there were the guards making their rounds. Heavy footsteps echoed through the galley at random times. A torch would suddenly flare to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Guards checked the chains, counted heads, and looked for any signs of trouble brewing. Their leather boots squeaked on the damp wooden floor. Nobody dared move when they passed by. Winter nights brought a different kind of torture. The Mediterranean got surprisingly cold, especially when you're wearing nothing but thin canvas clothes. Men huddled together for warmth, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Ice sometimes formed on the water buckets. Shivering made sleep nearly impossible, but exhaustion eventually won out. Summer presented the opposite problem. The lower deck became an oven. Hot, sticky air made breathing difficult. Men sweated even while sitting still. The wooden benches grew slick with moisture. Dehydration hit hard during those sweltering nights. Some men fainted and slumped over onto their neighbors. Snoring created its own chaos. Imagine trying to sleep while surrounded by dozens of exhausted men. Some snored like freight trains, others made whistling sounds through broken noses. A few talked in their sleep, calling out names of wives or children left behind. These sounds of home sometimes brought tears to listening ears in the darkness. Nightmares were common visitors. Men relived the moment of their capture. They dreamed of battles, raids, or the slave markets where they were sold. Some woke up screaming, only to remember where they were. The reality felt worse than any dream. At least in nightmares they sometimes escaped. The wooden benches had no padding whatsoever. Sitting on them for months wore calluses into men's backsides and legs. But at night, those same hard surfaces became their beds. Hip bones pressed against the wood. Shoulders ached from the awkward angles. Rolling over meant disturbing the entire row of sleeping men. Bathroom needs didn't stop at night. Men relieved themselves right where they sat, same as during the day. The smell grew even worse in the confined space. Waste collected in the bottom of the galley, creating a disgusting soup that sloshed back and forth with the ship's movement. Some men tried to make the best of bad situations. They shared quiet stories from home when the guards weren't listening. Others taught each other words in different languages. A few even managed to form friendships, despite the horrible conditions. These small human connections helped some survive the endless nights. Disease spread fastest during sleeping hours. Men coughed and wheezed in the close quarters. Fever victims shivered and sweated onto their neighbors. Open wounds attracted flies and infection. By morning, healthy men might wake up sick from whatever had been passed around during the night. The lucky ones eventually learned to sleep through almost anything. Their bodies adapted to the discomfort out of sheer necessity. They could doze, sitting up, lean against a neighbor, and ignore the rats running over their feet. This wasn't rest, it was survival mode. But even these terrible sleeping arrangements were just preparation for what came with dawn. When the sun rose, these men would face something that made uncomfortable nights seem like a minor inconvenience compared to the brutal physical demands waiting for them. The moment a galley slave first wrapped his hands around an oar, he knew his life had changed forever. These weren't ordinary oars like you'd find on a fishing boat. Each one stretched 45 feet from end to end and weighed more than most men could lift alone. The wood was thick as a tree trunk near the handle, tapering down to a massive blade that would slice through Mediterranean waters for hours at a time. 6 men worked each oar together. Had to, really. No single person could handle that much weight and water resistance. The rhythm became everything. Pull, lift, push forward, dip, pull again. Miss the beat by even a second, and the oar would slam into your ribs or crack against your neighbor's skull. Timing wasn't just important, it was survival. But here's where things got brutal. Rowers didn't work in comfortable shifts like sailors on merchant ships. When the captain wanted speed, everyone rowed. When he wanted to chase another vessel, everyone rowed. During battles, storms, or long voyages between ports, slaves could find themselves pulling those massive oars for 8, 10, even 12 hours straight. Your arms screamed, your back felt like it was breaking, and still the rhythm continued. The blisters came first. Within days of starting, every slave's palms turned into raw, bloody messes. The rough wood rubbed away skin faster than it could heal. Then calluses formed over the wounds, creating thick, ugly patches that cracked and bled again under constant use. Some men's hands looked more like leather gloves than human skin after months at the oars. Well, mistiming brought consequences nobody wanted to face. Guards prowled the rowing benches with whips ready, listening for the slightest break in rhythm. Splash, pull, lift, splash. The sound had to stay perfectly coordinated across all oars. One man getting tired or losing focus could throw off an entire section. The result? Shouting, cursing, and often the sharp crack of leather across shoulders and backs. Let's not forget the physical mechanics made everything worse. Slaves sat facing backward, so they couldn't see where the galley was heading. They pulled the oars toward their chests, using their entire bodies, legs pushing, backs straining, arms hauling with everything they had. The motion looked simple from a distance, but doing it hundreds of times in a row while chained to a bench turned into pure torture. The weird part is how the oar itself became both enemy and lifeline. It was the source of endless pain and exhaustion, sure, but it was also the only thing standing between a slave and a beating. Pull hard enough, keep the rhythm, don't break the stroke, and you might avoid the whip for another day. The oar demanded everything, but giving everything was the only way to survive. Then there was the coordination challenge. Remember, these weren't trained athletes working together. Galley slaves came from different countries, spoke different languages, had different builds and strength levels. A tall Frenchman might sit next to a short Moroccan and a middle-aged Spaniard, all trying to move one enormous oar in perfect sync. Communication happened through grunts, gestures, and painful trial and error. During rough weather, rowing became a nightmare beyond description, or waves tossed the galley around like a toy, making it nearly impossible to get the oar blades into the water at the right angle. Sometimes the oar would catch a wave wrong and slam backward, nearly breaking the arms of everyone holding it. Other times, the blade would miss the water entirely, sending all 6 men tumbling into each other. Makes sense that the strongest slaves got positioned in the middle of each oar, right? They provided the core power while weaker men on the ends helped guide the stroke. But strength wasn't everything. Experience mattered more. A veteran rower who knew how to read the water and predict the ship's movement was worth more than 3 strong newcomers who couldn't keep time. The rhythm never stopped echoing in their minds. Even during the brief moments of rest, slaves heard the phantom splash and pull of oars. The motion became so automatic that men would sometimes find themselves going through the rowing motions in their sleep, much to the annoyance of whoever was trying to rest beside them on the crowded benches. And yet, for all the agony of rowing, it was just one part of daily life aboard these floating prisons. The physical punishment of the oars was brutal enough, but the psychological warfare came from an entirely different source. The men who walked among the benches with whips in their hands and violence in their hearts. The rowing benches weren't just filled with sweating, exhausted slaves. Walking between those cramped rows were men whose job was simple: make sure nobody slowed down. These overseers, called comites and sous-comites, carried whips and had zero patience for weakness. Picture a galley overseer, and you might think of some cartoon villain twirling his mustache. The reality was both more boring and more terrifying. Most were just regular sailors doing a job. They walked up and down those narrow aisles between the benches, watching for any sign that someone wasn't pulling their weight. Literally, the whips they carried weren't decorative. Made from thick leather strips, often with metal tips, these tools could tear skin open with a single strike. The sound alone was enough to make nearby rowers flinch. That sharp crack echoing through the galley served as a constant reminder of what happened when you messed up. But here's the thing about the overseer system. It wasn't just about random cruelty. Well, not entirely. The galley had to move efficiently, or everyone died in battle. When 6 men worked a single massive oar, timing was everything. If one guy got tired and started pulling a half-second late, the whole rhythm fell apart. The oar would catch water wrong, maybe slam into another oar, and suddenly the entire side of the ship was rowing out of sync. The overseers knew this. They watched for the telltale signs: a rower's shoulders sagging, someone breathing too hard, or worst of all, a man letting his grip slip on the oar handle. The moment they spotted trouble, the whip came down. No warnings, no second chances. Different overseers had different styles, though none of them could be called gentle. Some were calculators, only whipping when they thought it would actually improve performance. Others seemed to enjoy the power a little too much. Then there were the ones who treated it like any other tedious job. They'd whip you for slacking the same way a modern boss might write you up for being late. The threat of violence kept the rowing deck eerily quiet most of the time. Slaves learned fast that talking, groaning, or even breathing too loudly could attract unwanted attention. The only sounds were the creaking of wood, the splash of oars, and the steady thump of feet keeping time. What made the whole system particularly nasty was how unpredictable it could be. Maybe you'd been rowing perfectly for hours, but your bench neighbor started falling behind. The overseer's whip might catch you anyway, just because you were close. Or perhaps you'd been struggling all morning, expecting punishment, but the overseer was distracted dealing with some crisis elsewhere on the ship. Some slaves tried to read their overseers like a survival manual. They'd learn which ones were morning grouches, who got meaner when the weather was bad, or which guards might look the other way if you needed an extra second to catch your breath. This wasn't friendship, it was pure survival instinct. The worst part wasn't even the physical pain, though that was bad enough. Whip marks left permanent scars, and repeated beatings could cripple a man's back or shoulders, but the psychological effect was devastating. Grown men, warriors who'd fought in battles, reduced to cowering whenever they heard footsteps behind them. Then there's the matter of medical care after a whipping. Spoiler alert, there wasn't any. Open wounds festered in the filthy conditions below deck. Infection was common, and many slaves died not from the beating itself, but from the rot that set in afterward. The overseers knew this, of course, they just didn't care. Interestingly, some overseers developed a twisted kind of expertise. They knew exactly how hard to hit to cause maximum pain without permanently damaging their investment. After all, dead slaves couldn't row, and badly injured ones slowed everyone down. It was a grim mathematics of suffering. The really experienced overseers could spot trouble before it started. They'd notice a slave's form getting sloppy, or see exhaustion creeping into someone's movements, and deliver a warning lash before the rhythm broke down. From their perspective, this was practically mercy. One quick strike now prevented a worse beating later. But don't think for a second that any of this made the overseers popular with the crew above deck either. Regular sailors often looked down on men whose job was essentially torturing prisoners all day. It was necessary work, but nobody pretended it was honorable. The constant threat of the whip shaped every moment of a galley slave's existence. Even when resting, even when eating their meager rations, that fear never completely disappeared. The overseers had created a floating prison, where terror was the most reliable tool for maintaining order. Of course, all this violence and intimidation was just the beginning of what made galley life unbearable. The whips kept slaves working, but they couldn't do anything about the other nightmare that haunted every moment below deck. The stench hit you before anything else. That nauseating mix of human waste, rotting food and unwashed bodies trapped in a wooden prison for months on end. Welcome to galley hygiene, or complete lack thereof. Slaves didn't get bathroom breaks. Why would they? Chained to their benches day and night, they had exactly one option when nature called, right where they sat. The wooden planks beneath their feet became a permanent toilet, and those planks were rarely cleaned. Actually, let's be honest, they were almost never cleaned. Picture this delightful scene: 150 men eating, sleeping, sweating and relieving themselves in the same cramped space for weeks at a time. The smell alone could knock you unconscious. But here's the twisted part: after a few days, your nose just gave up trying to process it all. The human body adapts to almost anything, even the most disgusting conditions imaginable. Then there were the rats. Oh, the rats loved galley ships. Dark corners, endless food scraps, and warm places to nest between the wooden beams. These weren't cute little mice either. We're talking about fat, bold rats that had zero fear of humans. They'd crawl right over sleeping slaves, steal food from their hands, and leave droppings everywhere. Some slaves actually tried to catch them for extra protein. Desperate times, right? Lice became everyone's constant companion. Remember those shaved heads from earlier? Well, that helped a little, but lice found other places to set up camp. Clothes, armpits, anywhere, with fabric or hair. The itching drove men crazy, but scratching too much could create open wounds, and open wounds on a filthy galley ship. That's asking for serious trouble. Fleas joined the party too. They hopped from person to person like they were at some kind of parasite festival. Bite marks covered everyone's arms and legs. The lucky slaves only dealt with itching. The unlucky ones developed infections that could turn deadly fast. But wait, there's more. The floors collected everything you can imagine. Vomit from seasick rowers, blood from whip marks, spilled food that turned moldy within hours. This toxic soup sloshed around the lower deck with every wave. During storms, slaves sat ankle-deep in this revolting mixture, unable to move away from it. Let's not forget the joy of eating in these conditions. Slaves received their daily bread and water while surrounded by human waste and crawling insects. They had no choice but to eat with dirty hands, often brushing flies away from their food. The wooden spoons they used were never washed. The water buckets, same story. Personal washing was basically non-existent. Maybe once a month, if the crew felt generous, they'd throw some seawater over the rowers. That was it. No soap, no scrubbing, just cold, salty water that left everyone feeling sticky and gross. Some slaves tried to clean themselves with torn pieces of cloth, but that barely made a dent in months of accumulated filth. The worst part about all this nastiness: disease spread like wildfire. One sick person could infect entire sections of the galley within days. Dysentery was particularly brutal. Imagine dealing with violent stomach problems while chained to a rowing bench. There was literally nowhere to go, and no way to stay clean. Skin conditions were universal. Salt water, sweat, and constant friction from chains created painful sores that never healed properly. These wounds attracted more insects and often became infected. Some slaves developed skin diseases that left permanent scars and disfigurement. Dental hygiene was another nightmare. Without any way to clean their teeth, most slaves developed serious tooth decay and gum disease. Bad breath was the least of their worries. Tooth pain could be excruciating, and there were no dentists making house calls to galley ships. Hair and beards, when they grew back between shavings, became matted with grease, sweat, and whatever else was floating around. Some men tried to keep themselves somewhat clean out of pride or habit, but the environment made it nearly impossible. The clothing situation made everything worse. Those rough tunics and canvas breeches absorbed every smell, every stain, every bit of nastiness from the ship. They were rarely changed, and never properly washed. After a few weeks, the clothes were probably more contaminated than the men wearing them. Sleep brought no relief from the filth. Lying down meant direct contact with those disgusting planks. Slaves learned to sleep sitting up, partly because of space constraints, but also because lying down meant swimming in the ship's accumulated waste. Yet somehow, human beings endured this. They adapted, survived, and maintained whatever dignity they could under impossible circumstances. The human spirit's ability to persist through such degrading conditions remains both heartbreaking and inspiring. Of course, the misery didn't end with poor hygiene. Weather added its own special brand of torture to galley life, creating challenges that made the filth seem almost bearable by comparison. The Mediterranean sun could be absolutely merciless. When you're chained to an oar with nowhere to hide, that blazing heat becomes your enemy. The wooden deck above would get so hot that drops of water would literally sizzle when they hit it. Slaves on the upper rowing positions felt like they were being slowly cooked alive. Your skin would blister and peel constantly. There wasn't any sunscreen in the 16th century, obviously. Just raw, burning flesh that never got a chance to heal properly. The salt from your own sweat would sting those open wounds like tiny needles. Day after day, the sun would beat down without mercy. But here's the twisted part. Many slaves actually preferred the scorching heat to what came next. Winter on a galley was a special kind of hell. When those Mediterranean storms rolled in, the temperature would plummet, rain would pour through every crack and opening in the ship. You'd think getting wet might feel refreshing after months of burning heat, right? Wrong. That freezing rainwater would soak through your thin canvas clothes and stay there. Remember, you couldn't stand up to wring out your shirt or change into dry clothes. You just sat there shivering in wet rags, while the cold seeped into your bones. The metal chains around your ankles became ice-cold shackles that made the pain even worse. Then there were the storms themselves. When you're chained in place and can't move, every wave becomes terrifying. The ship would pitch and roll violently, throwing slaves against each other and their oars. Some men would vomit from seasickness, adding to the already disgusting conditions below deck. The smell during storms was absolutely revolting. What made storms particularly nightmarish was the helplessness. Free sailors could at least try to hold on to something or brace themselves. Galley slaves just had to endure whatever the sea threw at them. Broken bones from being slammed around were common. Sometimes oars would snap under the pressure and send wooden splinters flying. Let's not forget the psychological torture of it all. Every major storm brought the very real possibility that the ship might sink. When you're chained to a bench, there's no swimming to safety, no climbing onto floating debris. You'd simply go down with the ship, unable to even try saving yourself. The weather also created these weird microclimates of misery throughout the galley. Slaves near the front of the ship got hit with more spray and wind. Those in the middle sections might be more protected but had to deal with worse air circulation. The guys at the back often got the worst of the engine smoke and cooking smells mixed with everything else. Rain brought its own special problems beyond just getting soaked. When water pooled on the deck above, it would drip down through the cracks, carrying with it all sorts of nasty stuff, tar, bird droppings, food scraps, and worse. This disgusting mixture would land on the slaves below, adding another layer to their misery. Winter also meant shorter days, which sounds like it might be a relief from rowing. But actually the long dark nights were often worse than the daylight hours of work. Huddled together in wet clothes, listening to the wind howl and the ship creak, many slaves wondered if they'd see another sunrise. The combination of wet and cold created perfect conditions for sickness to spread. Pneumonia, fever, and other illnesses would sweep through the rowing benches like wildfire. With no way to stay warm or dry, even strong men could be dead within days of getting sick. Here's something that might surprise you. The weather affected the guards and overseers too. When they were cold and miserable, they became even more brutal than usual. A soaked, freezing overseer with a whip was nobody's friend. They'd take out their own discomfort on the slaves, as if beating them might somehow improve the weather. But the absolute worst weather situation was probably the Mediterranean's sudden squalls. These storms could appear out of nowhere, going from calm seas to chaos in minutes. The ship would be caught unprepared, and everyone, slaves and crew alike, would have to endure whatever nature threw at them. Some slaves developed strange coping mechanisms for dealing with weather extremes. They'd try to time their breathing with the waves during storms, or focus intensely on small details to distract from the heat or cold, anything to keep their minds occupied when their bodies were suffering. The weather wasn't just an inconvenience. It was another instrument of torture that made galley life unbearable. Sun, rain, heat, cold, storms, they all conspired to break down both body and spirit. And speaking of things designed to break the human spirit, the system of punishments and discipline on these ships made the weather seem almost gentle by comparison. Life aboard a galley wasn't just hard work and bad food, breaking the rules. That's when things got really ugly. The overseers didn't mess around when it came to keeping order among hundreds of chained men crammed into a floating prison. Let's start with the basics. Talking without permission could earn you a solid beating with the dreaded whip. Sounds harsh for just chatting, right? Well, imagine trying to control 150 desperate men who'd love nothing more than to organize an escape or riot. Even a whispered conversation made the guards nervous. They'd rather crack a few skulls than deal with coordinated trouble later. Refusing to row was basically asking for a death sentence. Some slaves, pushed beyond their breaking point, would simply stop pulling their oar. The Comites didn't waste time with warnings. These rebellious rowers faced immediate and brutal consequences. Public beatings served as entertainment for the crew and terror for the other slaves. Makes you think twice about taking a break, doesn't it? Then there were the creative punishments that went way beyond a simple whipping. Troublemakers might get extra chains wrapped around their ankles or waist, making every movement agony. Heavy iron weights attached to already painful shackles turned basic tasks into torture. Some guards enjoyed watching difficult slaves struggle with these additional burdens for weeks at a time. The weird part is how they used psychological warfare too. Disobedient slaves sometimes got moved to the worst positions on the ship. Picture being chained right next to the waste bucket, or in the spot where seawater constantly dripped from above. Not exactly prime real estate, but effective punishment that reminded everyone what happened to troublemakers. Stealing food brought particularly nasty consequences. With everyone constantly hungry, the temptation to snatch an extra biscuit or sip of water was enormous. Caught red-handed, expect to lose your meager rations for days. Guards would make the thief watch others eat while their stomach cramped with hunger. Public humiliation mixed with starvation created powerful lessons for potential food thieves. Let's not forget the punishments designed purely to terrify other slaves. Sometimes an overseer would single out one man for extremely harsh treatment, not because he'd done anything particularly wrong but to send a message. Brutal beatings administered in full view of the rowing benches reminded everyone what could happen. Fear kept order better than any number of chains. But why were these punishments so severe? Simple math really. One overseer might be responsible for watching 50 chained men, all of whom had nothing left to lose. Without absolute discipline, the ship would descend into chaos within hours. Every small rebellion had to be crushed immediately and dramatically, or it would spread like wildfire through the benches. The smart slaves learned to read the moods of different guards. Some overseers were predictably brutal, while others might show occasional mercy. Knowing which commite was walking the benches could mean the difference between a quick slap and a life-threatening beating. Survival often depended on understanding these dangerous personalities. Attempted escapes during shore leave brought the worst punishments of all. Failed escapees faced torture that made regular beatings look gentle. Hot irons, prolonged chaining in impossible positions, and public floggings served as warnings to anyone else considering a run for freedom. The message was crystal clear: better to live in chains than die trying to break them. Religious disobedience carried its own special consequences. Slaves who refused to kiss religious icons or participate in Christian prayers faced extended punishment. Guards took these spiritual rebellions personally, seeing them as challenges to the entire system. Forced conversions backed up by whips proved surprisingly effective at creating outward compliance, if not genuine faith. Group punishments were another favorite tactic. When one slave misbehaved and the guards couldn't identify the culprit, everyone on that bench might lose meals or face beatings. This system turned slaves against each other, creating internal pressure to police their own behavior. Pretty clever, actually, if you ignore how completely evil it was. The unpredictability of punishment made everything worse. Sometimes guards ignored minor infractions completely. Other days they'd explode over tiny mistakes. This randomness kept slaves constantly on edge, never knowing when violence might erupt. Walking on eggshells became a full-time survival strategy. Medical treatment for injuries caused by punishment. Forget about it. Infected wounds from whip marks or broken bones from beatings healed however they wanted. Many slaves carried permanent reminders of their punishments in the form of scars, limps, or missing teeth. These visible marks served as ongoing warnings to other potential troublemakers. Of course, all this brutal discipline served one ultimate purpose: keeping the galley operational. Ships needed to reach their destinations on schedule, and that meant maintaining order among the human engines powering them forward. Every cracked whip and tightened chain served the efficiency of maritime commerce. The constant threat of punishment created an atmosphere of terror that went far beyond the physical pain itself. But even worse than the fear of discipline was the knowledge that every day brought new dangers that no amount of good behavior could prevent. Chained to a wooden bench with heavy iron shackles around both ankles, galley slaves faced a nightmare that went far beyond the daily beatings and starvation. The chains that kept them locked in place during rowing also sealed their fate if disaster struck the ship. When storms hit or battles raged, these same restraints became death sentences waiting to be carried out. Galleys weren't exactly built for stability. These long, narrow vessels sat low in the water, designed for speed and maneuverability rather than surviving rough seas. Their shallow draft made them perfect for coastal raids and quick attacks, but absolutely terrible in heavy weather. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. If the ship went down, every single rower went down with it. The chains weren't some flimsy rope that could be slipped off in an emergency. We're talking about heavy iron links riveted directly to the bench and secured around each slave's ankles with metal rings. Some ships added waist chains for extra security. Guards carried the keys, but during a crisis, freeing 150 men wasn't exactly their top priority. Actually, it wasn't a priority at all. Panic spread through the rowing decks faster than fire whenever storms approached. Slaves could feel the ship rolling beneath them, hear the creaking of wooden beams under stress, and watch water start seeping through the hull. But here's the cruel twist. They couldn't do anything about it. Can't swim to safety when you're bolted to furniture. Then there's the psychological torture of knowing exactly what would happen. These men weren't stupid. They understood that their chains, designed to prevent escape during calm weather, guaranteed drowning if the ship capsized. Every slave had probably heard stories of other galleys that went down with all hands. The rowers never survived. Ever. Battle situations made things even worse, if that's possible. Enemy ships would ram galleys deliberately, trying to punch holes in the hull or snap the vessel in half. Cannonballs could smash through the rowing decks, letting in torrents of seawater. Burning arrows might set the sails ablaze, creating chaos above while slaves remained trapped below. Throughout all this violence and destruction, the rowers had to keep working their oars, following orders even as their ship literally fell apart around them. Weather didn't need to be catastrophic to create deadly situations either. Mediterranean storms could whip up suddenly, turning calm seas into churning nightmares within hours. Galleys caught in unexpected squalls had their low-sitting hulls swamped by waves that larger ships would barely notice. The combination of heavy chains, crowded conditions, and rising water created perfect drowning chambers. Some slaves tried to prepare for disaster in small ways. They'd study the guards' routines, memorizing who carried keys and where they stored them. Others would work on loosening their shackles slightly, though getting caught meant severe punishment. A few attempted to forge crude lockpicks from bits of metal, but the riveted chains made such efforts mostly useless. Guards knew about the slaves' fears and sometimes used them as threats. Disobedient rowers might be told their chains would be extra tight during the next storm, or that key-carrying guards would abandon the lower decks first if trouble started. These psychological weapons proved just as effective as whips for maintaining discipline. The cramped rowing quarters made mass drowning almost inevitable during any serious emergency. With 5 men squeezed onto benches designed for 3, and heavy oars blocking movement between the rows, evacuation would have been impossible, even without chains. Add iron shackles to the equation, and you've got a death trap that would make modern safety inspectors weep. Experienced sailors on other types of ships often refused to serve aboard galleys, partly because they knew about the human cargo chained below decks. Professional seamen understood that ships sometimes sink, it's an occupational hazard. But choosing to sail on a vessel loaded with doomed prisoners felt too much like tempting fate. Religious slaves found their faith tested by this particular horror. Drowning while chained seemed like such a cruel and undignified way to die. Some prayed for quick deaths in battle instead, hoping enemy swords might reach them before rising water did. Others begged for divine intervention to calm storms or strengthen their ship's hull. The worst part might have been the waiting. When rough weather hit, slaves could only sit chained to their benches, listening to the sounds of a ship in distress, creaking timbers, shouting sailors, crashing waves, all while being completely powerless to affect the outcome. They became passive passengers on their own funeral ship. But the fear of drowning, terrifying as it was, couldn't compare to the immediate dangers that slaves faced during actual combat. When battle drums started beating and enemy ships approached, chained rowers discovered that capsizing wasn't their only concern. When cannon smoke filled the air and enemy ships closed in, galley slaves didn't get to hide below deck or grab weapons to defend themselves. They just kept rowing. While sailors scrambled across the deck preparing for battle, the chained men at the oars had one job that never changed: pull those massive wooden beams through the water, no matter what hell broke loose around them. Battle meant the galley needed to move fast and turn quickly. The captain shouted orders from above, while the overseers cracked their whips with even more fury than usual. Every stroke had to be perfect. Too slow, and an enemy ship might ram them. Too fast, and the rowers would collapse from exhaustion before the fight even started. Makes sense why the whips came out more often during combat, right? Then there's the noise. Cannons booming, men screaming, wood splintering when cannonballs hit the hull. The sound alone was enough to drive someone mad, but the slaves couldn't cover their ears or duck for safety. Their hands stayed locked on those oars while death flew overhead in the form of iron balls and flaming arrows. Enemy projectiles didn't care if you were a free sailor or a chained slave. Cannonballs crashed through the galley's sides, sometimes taking out entire sections of rowers in one horrible instant. A man might be pulling his oar 1 second and missing his head the next. The slaves sitting beside him would have to keep rowing while blood pooled at their feet. No time to mourn, no time to move the body, just keep pulling. Arrows presented their own special terror. They came down like deadly rain and chained men couldn't dodge or seek cover. Some arrows pierced arms or shoulders, leaving the wounded slave still attached to his oar but barely able to work it. The overseers had little patience for injury during battle. A wounded rower either found strength he didn't know he had, or faced the whip for slowing down his bench. But here's the twisted part. Sometimes battles were the only chance slaves got to see the outside world properly. While pulling with all their might, they could glimpse other ships, foreign coastlines or distant cities through the smoke and chaos. For men who spent months seeing nothing but the inside of their floating prison, even a war zone looked like freedom. The worst battles happened when galleys rammed each other. 2 ships would charge at full speed, trying to punch holes in the enemy's hull or snap off their oars. When this happened, the slaves doing the ramming felt the tremendous crash as their ship's metal-tipped bow smashed into wood and flesh. The impact threw everyone forward in their chains. Broken ribs were common. Dislocated shoulders too. If your galley was the one getting rammed, well, that's when things got really ugly. The enemy's pointed bow could punch right through the rowing deck, crushing anyone unlucky enough to be in its path. Water would start pouring in through the hole, and slaves chained near the breach knew they'd probably drown before anyone bothered to free them. Let's not forget about Greek fire and other incendiary weapons. When these burning liquids hit the deck above, flaming drops would fall through cracks onto the rowers below. Men caught fire while still chained to their benches. The screaming was horrible, but again, surviving slaves had to keep working their oars while their companions burned alive just feet away. Some battles dragged on for hours. Imagine pulling those heavy oars at combat speed while cannonballs exploded around you and dead bodies piled up on your bench. Exhaustion meant nothing. Fear meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was keeping the galley moving so the soldiers above could do their job. When galleys fought at close range, enemy sailors sometimes tried to board the ship. Sword fights broke out right above the slaves' heads. Blood dripped down between the deck boards. Occasionally a wounded fighter would fall into the rowing area, landing on top of chained men who couldn't move out of the way. These unfortunate souls might get stabbed by accident when the fallen warrior kept swinging his blade. And here's something that really shows how expendable galley slaves were. Dead rowers often stayed chained to their oars until after the battle ended. Their bodies would slump forward while the survivors on their bench struggled to work around them. The smell of death mixed with gunpowder and sea spray created a stench that stuck in your nose for days. Victory or defeat. The slaves rarely knew which side won until much later. They were too busy trying to survive the immediate horror of combat to follow the bigger picture. All they knew was when the fighting stopped, and they could finally take a breath without expecting it to be their last. But surviving one battle only meant you'd probably face another soon enough, and each time the odds of making it through got a little worse. After months or even years chained to the same bench, something almost miraculous could happen. The galley would dock at a port, and a few lucky slaves might actually get to step off the ship. Shore leave wasn't exactly a vacation, but for men who hadn't felt solid ground beneath their feet in ages, it felt like touching heaven itself. The selection process was brutal and calculated. Guards picked only the most trusted slaves, usually the ones who'd been broken down completely or those too weak to run far. Fresh captives? Forget about it. They stayed chained while others got this tiny taste of freedom. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. You had to prove you'd given up hope of escape before they'd give you a chance to actually escape. Those chosen for shore duty finally got shoes. Real shoes. After months of bare feet on splintered wood, even rough leather sandals felt like luxury. The moment feet hit the dock, many slaves would stumble and fall. Their legs, cramped from sitting for endless months, had forgotten how to walk properly on steady ground. Shore work meant hauling supplies from warehouses to the ship. Sacks of grain, barrels of water, coils of rope, everything had to be carried by hand. The work was backbreaking, but nobody complained. Fresh air filled their lungs instead of the thick stench below deck. Sunlight warmed their faces without the crushing heat of being trapped in the galley's belly. Even the simple act of looking up at the sky without iron chains cutting into their ankles felt incredible. Then there were the escape attempts. Despite careful selection, some slaves couldn't resist the temptation. The moment guards looked away, they'd bolt. Most didn't make it far. Weak legs, distinctive clothing and shaved heads made them easy to spot in crowded ports. Local authorities knew exactly what to look for and were paid well for returning runaways. But here's the fascinating part. Some guards actually expected a few escape attempts. It was almost like a twisted game. They'd place bets on which slave would try to run and how far they'd get before being dragged back. The punishment for failed escape was swift and public. Other slaves had to watch as the runaway received brutal lashings, sometimes losing privileges like shore duty for the entire crew. Smart slaves used shore time differently. They'd listen carefully to conversations around the docks, picking up news from the outside world. Wars ending, new conflicts starting, changes in rulers, any information could be valuable. Some slaves became unofficial news networks, quietly sharing what they'd learned with others back on the ship. The contrast between shore and ship life was almost too much to bear. On land, they'd see free people going about normal lives, merchants haggling over prices, children playing in the streets, women hanging laundry, families sharing meals. For men who'd forgotten such simple pleasures existed, these glimpses could be either inspiring or devastating. Local townspeople had mixed reactions to galley slaves. Some showed pity, secretly slipping bread or fruit to the workers when guards weren't watching. Others treated them like dangerous criminals, crossing streets to avoid them. Children often stared with wide eyes, fascinated by these strange men in rough clothing and chains. Religious aspects played a role too. In Christian ports, some slaves were marched to churches for forced prayers. They'd have to kiss religious statues and participate in ceremonies. Refusing meant immediate return to the ship and punishment. Many went through the motions while silently praying to their own gods for true freedom. The psychological impact of shore leave was complex. Some slaves returned to their benches with renewed hope, having seen the world still existed beyond their floating prison. Others came back more depressed than ever, the brief taste of freedom making their chains feel even heavier. Guards understood this psychology perfectly. They knew exactly how much hope to give before snatching it away again. Weather affected shore duties dramatically. Rain meant slipping on wet docks while carrying heavy loads. Extreme heat made the work nearly unbearable for men already weakened by poor diet and cramped conditions. Winter shore duty was particularly brutal, as slaves had little protection against cold winds and icy surfaces. The return to the ship always came too soon. That moment when shoes were taken away and chains locked back in place marked the end of the brief reprieve. Many slaves would look back at the shore one last time, memorizing the sight of free land disappearing as the galley prepared to leave port. Well, shore leave was just one small break in the endless routine of galley life. But even when stuck on the ship, slaves found themselves doing more than just rowing. The vessel required constant maintenance and repairs, creating a whole different set of brutal tasks that kept everyone busy between the exhausting sessions at the oars. Rowing wasn't the only back-breaking job waiting for galley slaves. When the oars weren't moving, there was always something else to do. Always. The moment a galley docked or anchored, new orders rang out across the benches. Mending sails became a common task, especially after storms or battles had torn the heavy canvas to shreds. Slaves would be handed massive needles, thick as pencils and coarse thread that cut into their already damaged fingers. The sails were enormous, sometimes weighing hundreds of pounds when wet, and wrestling with them required multiple men working together while still chained to their positions. But here's the thing about sail repair, it was actually one of the better jobs. Why? You got to work with your hands doing something different, and the overseers couldn't whip you as easily when you were handling delicate sailcloth. Tear the sail worse, and everyone suffered when the wind picked up. Then there was deck scrubbing. This meant crawling on hands and knees with rough brushes and buckets of seawater, trying to clean away months of accumulated filth, blood and worse. The wooden planks had absorbed years of human misery, and no amount of scrubbing could really get them clean. Slaves would spend hours working the brush in circles until their knuckles bled, all while guards stood over them shouting about missed spots. Some slaves became the ship's unofficial tailors and cobblers. Those rough brown tunics and canvas breeches didn't last long under the constant strain of rowing and the salt air's corrosive effects. Torn clothing meant exposure to the elements, which could kill you faster than a whip, so slaves learned to patch and mend with whatever scraps they could find. Thread was precious. A needle was treasure. Let's not forget the chain maintenance. Ironic, right? Slaves had to repair and maintain the very shackles that held them prisoner. Chains rusted constantly in the salt air, and broken links meant escape attempts, something no captain could risk. Slaves would file rust, oil hinges and even forge new links when needed. They became experts at metalwork out of pure necessity, hammering away at the iron that bound them. Rope work was another endless task. Galleys used hundreds of feet of rope for rigging, anchoring, and securing cargo. Salt water rotted rope quickly, so there was always splicing, braiding and replacing to be done. Slaves developed coil-used fingers that could work rope even in the dark. The skill was useful, but it also meant more work assignments. Cargo loading and unloading fell to the strongest slaves, usually during brief shore stops. Heavy barrels of water, sacks of grain, cannonballs and weapons all had to be moved by hand. Since slaves couldn't leave their bench area, this meant passing everything hand to hand down long human chains. Drop something valuable, and the punishment was swift and brutal. Well, there was also the lovely job of ship maintenance below deck. This meant crawling into the lowest, darkest parts of the galley to patch holes, replace rotted wood, and clear blockages. The smell down there was indescribable, a mixture of bilge water, rot and human waste that had accumulated over years. Slaves assigned to this work often came back up, gagging and dizzy. Food preparation, when it could be called that, sometimes fell to slaves as well. This meant soaking the rock-hard biscuits until they were soft enough to chew, or stirring the watery bean stew in massive pots. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. preparing food you'd barely get to eat yourself. And the weird part is how specialized some slaves became. One might develop a reputation for sail work, another for rope splicing, and a third for metal work. Guards remembered who was good at what, which meant both more work assignments and slightly better treatment. Being useful meant staying alive longer. Seasonal work added variety to the misery. Winter meant constant bailing of water that seeped through the hull, while summer brought the job of rigging canvas covers to provide shade. Not for the slaves, of course, but for the officers and equipment that couldn't handle direct sun. Some slaves even learned basic carpentry out of necessity. Oars broke regularly under the stress of rowing and storms, and new ones had to be shaped and fitted quickly. A galley without enough working oars was a sitting duck in battle or bad weather. Slaves became surprisingly skilled woodworkers, carving replacement parts with whatever tools they could access. Makes sense, right? When your life depends on keeping the ship functional, you learn fast or you die. The most exhausting part wasn't any single task. It was the constant switching between different types of work without rest. Row for 6 hours, then mend sail for 3, then scrub deck until dark, then back to the oars at dawn. Your body never adapted to any one motion or position. But even these varied tasks couldn't prepare slaves for what happened when the ship encountered other vessels on the open sea, and the drums began beating the rhythm for battle stations. Life chained to a galley bench created the strangest social dynamics you could imagine. Picture being locked shoulder to shoulder with complete strangers, unable to move more than a few inches in any direction, for months or even years. These weren't your neighbors from back home. These were men from completely different worlds, speaking languages you'd never heard, following customs that made no sense to you. Most slaves barely spoke at all during their first weeks aboard. Fear kept their mouths shut tighter than their chains kept their bodies locked down. One wrong word could earn a brutal whipping. One complaint could mean extra punishment that might kill you. So new arrivals learned quickly that silence meant survival. But humans aren't built for endless quiet, especially when they're suffering together. Language barriers turned simple communication into an impossible puzzle. A Spanish fisherman chained next to a Moroccan trader had no way to share even basic needs. Hand gestures became a crude universal language. Pointing at water meant thirst. Touching your stomach meant hunger. Grimacing and pointing at wounds meant pain. These weren't exactly deep philosophical conversations, but they were human connections in an inhuman place. Then there's the matter of personal space, which simply didn't exist. 6 men crammed onto a bench meant for 3 created friction that went beyond physical discomfort. Different cultures had different ideas about cleanliness, prayer times and basic manners. What seemed normal to one man might disgust another. A North African Muslim trying to pray 5 times daily, while chained between 2 Italian Catholics, created tension nobody could escape from. But something remarkable happened to those who survived long enough. Friendships formed despite every obstacle working against them. Shared suffering has a way of breaking down barriers that would normally take years to overcome. A French nobleman who'd never spoken to a commoner back home might find himself depending on a Turkish peasant for emotional survival. Social class meant nothing when everyone wore the same filthy rags and pulled the same brutal oars. The age differences told their own tragic story. Most slaves looked decades older than their actual years. A man of 30 might appear 50 after just 2 years at the oars. Constant stress, poor food, brutal labor, and zero medical care aged bodies at an incredible rate. Grey hair and deeply lined faces became the uniform everyone eventually wore. Makes sense, right? Your body can only take so much punishment before it starts showing the damage. Veterans who'd survived multiple seasons developed an unofficial hierarchy based purely on endurance. These weathered survivors knew which guards to avoid when storms were coming, and how to make the meager rations last a bit longer. New arrivals quickly learned to watch these old-timers for survival tips that could mean the difference between life and death. Late at night, when the overseers finally stopped their endless pacing, whispered conversations became the closest thing to entertainment anyone got. Stories from home were precious currency traded in hushed tones. A man from Sicily might describe the taste of fresh olives to someone who'd never seen the Mediterranean. A farmer from inland France would paint word pictures of green fields that seemed like fantasy to men who'd forgotten any color except the gray of the galley walls. Well, these nighttime conversations served another crucial purpose. They kept memories alive. Without photos or letters or any connection to their former lives, slaves had to rely entirely on their own minds to remember who they'd been before the chains. Talking about home, even in broken fragments of shared vocabulary, helped preserve pieces of identity that the galley system was designed to destroy. The weird part is how protective relationships developed among benchmates. Men who'd initially distrusted each other fiercely would eventually share food, cover for each other during illness, and even risk punishment to help a struggling companion. These bonds formed purely from necessity, but they often ran deeper than friendships made in freedom. Religious differences created some of the most interesting dynamics aboard the galleys. Christians, Muslims, and Jews found themselves chained together in circumstances none of their faiths had specifically prepared them for. Some maintained rigid separation even in slavery. Others discovered that prayers for deliverance sounded remarkably similar regardless of which direction you faced while saying them. But the friendships that did form carried their own special agony. Watching a friend die from disease or exhaustion, knowing you couldn't help or even properly mourn, added another layer of psychological torture to an already unbearable situation. Survivors learned to grieve quickly and quietly, because dwelling on loss was a luxury they couldn't afford. These complex relationships among the slaves created something the ship's officers never expected, small networks of mutual support that made the brutal system slightly more bearable. Which brings us to another aspect of galley life that surprised many, the rare moments when even some overseers showed unexpected mercy. Disease was basically a death sentence on a galley. When you pack 150 men into a space barely big enough for 50, with zero ventilation and even less hygiene, sickness spreads faster than gossip in a small town. One cough could doom an entire section of rowers within days. The most common killer was dysentery. This nasty intestinal disease turned strong men into walking skeletons. Slaves would develop severe diarrhea, cramping and fever that left them too weak to pull their oar. But here's the brutal part. They still had to row. Sick or not, the ship needed to move, and overseers didn't care if you were dying. They'd whip a man with a 104-degree fever just as hard as a healthy one. Fevers ran rampant through the cramped quarters. Malaria, typhoid, and other infections spread like wildfire. Men would wake up burning hot one day, delirious and shaking the next. Without any real medical care, fever victims either recovered on their own or died. Most died. The mortality rate was staggering. Some estimates suggest up to 30% of galley slaves died from disease alone each year. Then there were the wounds that wouldn't heal. Remember, these men lived in filth. Every cut, scrape or blister became a potential infection site. The constant friction from rowing created open sores on hands and backs. Salt water and sweat made everything worse. What started as a simple blister could turn into a festering wound that eventually killed through blood poisoning. Scurvy was another silent killer. Months at sea with no fresh fruits or vegetables meant vitamin C deficiency. Teeth would loosen and fall out. Old wounds would reopen. Men would bleed from their gums until they were too weak to continue. The irony, fresh citrus could have prevented this entirely, but galley captains rarely bothered with such luxuries for their slaves. Respiratory diseases thrived in the damp, poorly ventilated lower decks. Pneumonia claimed many lives during winter months. The combination of cold, wet conditions and exhausted immune systems created perfect conditions for lung infections. Slaves would develop terrible coughs that turned into pneumonia within days. But here's what made the situation truly horrific. There was no medical care whatsoever, no doctors, no medicine, no treatment of any kind. If you got sick, you were entirely on your own. Sometimes fellow slaves might share water or try to help, but they risked punishment for leaving their positions. The ship's officers viewed sick slaves as nothing more than broken equipment. Well, that's not entirely true. There was one form of medical care: throwing the dying overboard. When a slave became too sick to work and seemed unlikely to recover, guards would simply toss him into the sea. Dead or alive didn't matter much. This served two purposes. It freed up space on the crowded bench and supposedly prevented disease from spreading further. The psychological toll of watching men die around you was devastating. Slaves witnessed their benchmates waste away from disease with no hope of help. The smell of infection, vomit, and death became part of daily life. Many healthy slaves developed what we'd now recognize as severe depression and anxiety, just from the constant exposure to suffering. Some diseases were particularly gruesome. Gangrene could set in from infected wounds literally rotting away fingers, toes, or entire limbs. The stench was unbearable, but the victim remained chained to his oar until death. Skin diseases caused by poor nutrition and filthy conditions left men covered in painful sores and rashes. Dehydration killed plenty of slaves too. The daily water ration was barely enough for healthy men doing light work. For sick slaves losing fluids through fever, diarrhea, or vomiting, it wasn't nearly sufficient. Men would literally die of thirst while surrounded by ocean water they couldn't drink. Parasites were constant companions. Intestinal worms, lice, fleas, and other creatures fed off the weakened slaves. These parasites weakened already sick men further and helped spread disease throughout the ship. Wrecks carried diseases too, and they were everywhere on galleys. The cruel irony was that healthy slaves were valuable property, but sick ones became worthless instantly. Captains had no incentive to provide medical care because replacement slaves were usually cheaper than medicine. This cold economic calculation meant that even treatable conditions became death sentences. Mental illness was common but completely misunderstood. Men who broke down mentally were usually beaten for malingering or laziness. The constant stress, trauma, and hopelessness drove many slaves insane, but this was seen as defiance rather than illness. The combination of poor nutrition, exhaustion, stress, and unsanitary conditions created a perfect storm for disease. Most slaves' immune systems were so compromised that even minor illnesses became life-threatening. A simple cold could progress to pneumonia and death within a week. But even amid all this suffering, the human spirit sometimes found ways to endure. Some slaves developed unexpected bonds while caring for the sick, creating small moments of humanity in an inhuman system. Religion aboard a galley wasn't exactly optional. Faith became both a lifeline and another chain around already bound ankles. Christian slaves found themselves forced into daily prayer routines whether they wanted to participate or not. Guards would march down the rows of benches, demanding everyone bow their heads during morning prayers. Miss the cue, that earned you a crack across the shoulders with a rod. The irony wasn't lost on anyone being beaten into showing devotion to a God of mercy. But here's where things got complicated. Not every slave was Christian. Muslims, Jews, and men from various other faiths sat chained to the same oars. Yet they all had to participate in Catholic rituals or face punishment. Picture trying to explain religious freedom to a galley captain in the 1600s. Good luck with that conversation. The ship's chaplain would parade religious statues and icons down the narrow walkways between the rowing benches. Each slave had to kiss these holy objects as they passed. Refusing meant extra lashes or being denied your already meager water ration. Some men kissed the statues while silently praying to their own gods. Others simply went through the motions, their minds elsewhere entirely. Sunday services were particularly brutal affairs. The entire crew of rowers would be forced to sit through long sermons in Latin, a language most couldn't understand anyway. Backs already aching from rowing would cramp up even worse during these extended periods of forced stillness. The chaplain would drone on about salvation and forgiveness while men sat chained like animals just feet away. Religious holidays meant different things depending on your perspective. Christmas or Easter might bring slightly better food, maybe some wine instead of water, or bread that wasn't completely stale. But these same holidays often meant longer prayer services and more forced religious participation. Some slaves actually dreaded feast days because the extended ceremonies made their backs and legs hurt worse than regular rowing. Then there were the private prayers. Late at night, when the guards weren't paying close attention, whispered prayers would float through the darkness. Christian slaves prayed for rescue or a quick death. Muslims quietly recited verses from the Quran they'd memorized as children. Jewish prisoners spoke ancient Hebrew words their grandfathers had taught them. These secret prayers created an odd sense of community among the rowers. Men who couldn't speak each other's languages would recognize the rhythm of prayer, even if the words were foreign. A Christian might nod respectfully when he heard his Muslim benchmate whispering evening prayers. Small gestures, but they mattered in a place where humanity was constantly stripped away. Religious tokens became precious beyond measure. A tiny wooden cross carved from a broken oar. A piece of cloth with Quranic verses sewn in barely visible thread. These items were hidden carefully and shared secretly among trusted neighbors on the benches. Getting caught with unauthorized religious items meant severe punishment, but men risked it anyway. Some slaves found genuine comfort in their faith, despite the forced participation in foreign rituals. They believed their suffering had meaning, that God was testing them or preparing them for something greater. Others lost faith entirely. Hard to believe in divine justice when you're chained to an oar for crimes you didn't commit, or simply for being in the wrong place when raiders attacked your village. The ship's officers had their own relationship with religion. They attended proper services in their quarters, while the slaves participated in mandatory deck prayers. This religious hierarchy was just another reminder of the vast distance between the free and the enslaved. Same God, completely different treatment. Confession created particularly strange situations. The chaplain would sometimes offer to hear confessions from slaves who requested it. But what sins could a man confess when his biggest crime was usually just existing in the wrong place at the wrong time? Some slaves confessed to hating their captors or dreaming of revenge. Others confessed to losing faith itself. Religious hope took many forms aboard the galleys. Some men believed they would be rescued through divine intervention. Others prayed simply for strength to survive another day. A few held on to faith that their suffering would be rewarded in the afterlife, even if this life held nothing but pain. The most heartbreaking prayers were often the simplest ones. Men praying to see their families again. Fathers asking God to watch over children they'd never see grow up. Husbands hoping their wives would remarry and find happiness. These weren't grand theological discussions, just broken hearts speaking to whatever divine force might be listening. But religious routine did something unexpected too. It marked time in a place where days blurred into endless sameness. Morning prayers meant dawn. Evening prayers meant another day survived. The rhythm of religious observance became a calendar for men who had lost track of months and years. Yet even as faith provided comfort and structure, it couldn't change the fundamental reality of galley life. Tomorrow would bring the same chains, the same oars, and the same desperate struggle for survival that made every single day feel like a test of endurance. Time becomes your worst enemy when you're chained to a galley oar. Not because it moves too fast, but because it crawls so slowly that each day feels like a month. The sun rises, you row. The sun sets, you row. Tomorrow, more rowing. Next week, still rowing. It's a special kind of torture that breaks minds faster than whips break skin. Most galley slaves lost track of time within their first few months. Makes sense, right? When every single day looks identical to the last one, your brain stops bothering to keep score. No calendars, no holidays, no birthdays. Just the endless rhythm of oars hitting water and the crack of the overseer's whip. Some prisoners tried scratching marks into the wood to count days, but guards usually beat them for damaging ship property. The worst part wasn't losing track of days or weeks. It was losing track of years. Men would argue whether they'd been rowing for 2 years or 5, and nobody could settle the debate. Your beard grew longer, your muscles got weaker, your teeth fell out, but time itself became this mysterious thing that slipped through your fingers like seawater. Then there's the crushing reality that nobody tells you how long your sentence actually lasts. Criminal slaves might know they're supposed to serve 10 years, but what does that mean when you can't count past the first 100 days? War prisoners had it even worse because their captivity wasn't based on time served, but on whether someone back home cared enough to negotiate their freedom. Some waited decades for rescue that never came. The daily routine made everything blur together into one endless nightmare. Wake up cramped on your bench. Eat your stale bread. Row until your hands bleed. Get whipped for slowing down. Row some more. Eat watery soup if you're lucky. Or row until darkness falls. Sleep sitting up in chains. Repeat tomorrow, and every day after that, until you die, or go insane. Well, the monotony did something horrible to prisoners' minds. Men who came aboard sharp and alert gradually became hollow-eyed and vacant. They'd respond to commands and pull their oars, but the spark that made them human slowly flickered out. Guards called this condition oar madness, and they preferred slaves who developed it, because broken men cause fewer problems than desperate ones. But the psychological damage went deeper than simple boredom. When you can't measure time, you start losing pieces of yourself. Memories of home grow fuzzy around the edges. Did your daughter have brown eyes or blue? Was your house near the church or the market square? Important details slip away because your brain has no framework to organize them anymore. Some slaves tried creating their own time markers. They'd remember the storm winter or the battle summer as reference points. Others tracked time by watching new prisoners arrive and guessing how long previous groups had been aboard. These mental tricks helped a little, but they couldn't stop the relentless erosion of hope that came with endless, unmeasured suffering. The weird part is how hope itself became a burden after enough time passed. New slaves always believed rescue was coming soon. Maybe next month, maybe next season, but veterans knew better. They'd watched countless men die while still believing freedom was just around the corner. After years of disappointment, hope transforms from comfort into cruel joke. Physical changes provided the only real calendar available to galley slaves. Your muscles wasted away, despite constant rowing because the food was so poor. Your skin turned leather tough from sun and salt spray. Scars accumulated from whippings and accidents. Men looked in each other's faces and saw calendars written in wrinkles, missing teeth, and grey hair. Let's not forget how the endless routine wore down even the strongest personalities. Men who'd been leaders in their communities became silent and submissive. Proud warriors learned to keep their heads down and avoid eye contact with guards. The galley didn't just steal years from their lives, it stole the essence of who they used to be. The most heartbreaking conversations happened when new prisoners asked veterans how long they'd been rowing. Old-timers would shrug and guess maybe 8 years, or probably more than 10. That uncertainty was almost worse than knowing you had a life sentence, because at least condemned men could count down to their execution date. Some found twisted comfort in accepting that time no longer mattered. If yesterday, today and tomorrow were all identical, why bother trying to distinguish between them? This surrender to timelessness became a survival mechanism, though it came at the cost of ever feeling truly alive again. The passing seasons provided the only reliable time markers available, but even those blurred together after multiple cycles of hot summers and freezing winters spent chained to the same bench, pulling the same oar, listening to the same commands shouted by the same brutal guards. Yet somehow, whispered stories of the outside world still managed to reach the benches, carrying news that reminded slaves that time continued moving in the real world, even when their own lives had stopped completely. Life at sea breeds strange beliefs. When you're trapped on a floating wooden box surrounded by endless water, your mind starts creating explanations for every creak, shadow, and unexpected sound. Galley slaves and sailors alike developed elaborate superstitions that helped them cope with the terrifying unpredictability of ocean life. Sea monsters topped the list of fears. Everyone had heard stories about massive tentacled beasts that could wrap around an entire galley and drag it to the bottom. Sailors swore they'd seen glowing eyes beneath the waves during night watches. Some slaves claimed to have witnessed giant serpents following their ship for days, just waiting for the right moment to strike. Were these real creatures or hallucinations born from exhaustion and fear? Nobody wanted to find out. Then there were the omens. A dolphin swimming alongside the galley meant good luck was coming, but a dead fish floating belly up near the oars, that spelled disaster. Seabirds landing on the mast brought messages from home, while birds that refused to come near the ship meant death was stalking someone on board. Slaves learned to read these signs as carefully as any ancient priest. Weather patterns became loaded with meaning too. Red skies might promise fair sailing, but green-tinted clouds warned of storms that could tear the ship apart. Lightning that struck the water 3 times in a row meant the sea gods were angry. Rain that fell while the sun was shining. Someone on board was about to die within 3 days. These beliefs spread faster than any disease. Personal tokens offered protection against the worst dangers. Slaves who still owned small personal items guarded them like precious jewels. A smooth stone from home could ward off seasickness. A piece of rope tied in 7 knots prevented drowning. Some men carved tiny crosses or crescents into their oar handles, believing these symbols would keep their hands from slipping during crucial moments. But the most powerful superstition involved ghost ships. Veteran sailors whispered about encountering galleys that had supposedly sunk years earlier, still rowing through foggy nights with crews of dead men. These phantom vessels were said to appear before major battles or terrible storms, warning the living of approaching doom. Slaves who claimed to have seen such ships often died within days, leading others to believe the dead were calling them to join their eternal voyage. Lucky and unlucky numbers dominated daily life. Starting a journey on the 13th day of any month guaranteed catastrophe. Counting exactly 100 strokes of the oar brought good fortune for the rest of the day. Having an odd number of men on a bench invited accidents. These numerical obsessions gave slaves a small sense of control in their powerless existence. Food superstitions were equally elaborate. Eating the last bite of bread from a loaf brought 7 years of hunger. Spilling wine meant someone would spill blood before sunset. Finding a worm in your biscuit actually meant good luck was coming, though most slaves found this particular belief hard to swallow, literally. Some slaves developed personal rituals to survive each day. They might touch their chains in a specific sequence before rowing began. Others whispered the same prayer exactly 17 times during their morning meal. A few insisted on always stepping onto the deck with their right foot first. These tiny ceremonies created pockets of order in lives ruled by chaos. Weather magic fascinated everyone. Certain slaves claimed they could predict storms by watching how rats moved around the lower decks. Others insisted that throwing breadcrumbs to seabirds in a particular pattern could change wind direction. Whistling while rowing supposedly summoned favorable winds, but whistling at night called up dangerous squalls. The rules seemed endless and contradictory. Death omens carried the most weight. Dreams about home meant you'd never see it again. Hearing your mother's voice calling your name over the water meant your family was mourning you as dead. Seeing your own reflection in the ocean during a full moon predicted you'd drown within a lunar cycle. These dark prophecies terrified men who already lived on the edge of despair. Religious symbols from different faiths mixed together in strange ways. Christian crosses, Islamic crescents and pagan charms all found places among the superstitions. Desperate men grabbed onto any belief that might offer protection. The gods of the sea didn't care about your original religion anyway. Ships themselves developed reputations as lucky or cursed. Some galleys seemed to sail through every danger unharmed, while others suffered constant disasters. Slaves assigned to notorious death ships often gave up hope before their first voyage even began. The galley's history became part of their personal fate. These elaborate belief systems created an invisible world running parallel to the harsh physical reality of galley life. While superstitions couldn't break chains or fill empty stomachs, they provided something almost as valuable, the illusion that unseen forces might be working in your favor. Yet even the most elaborate superstitions couldn't prepare slaves for the strangest disruptions to their routine. Sometimes the outside world reached into their floating prison in completely unexpected ways. When a galley pulled into port, everything changed for the chained rowers below deck. The constant rhythm of rowing stopped. Voices carried differently across the water, new sounds filtered down through the wooden planks above their heads. Port cities meant one thing that rarely happened at sea: contact with the outside world. For men who had been isolated for months or even years, these brief encounters became lifelines to sanity. The smell of fresh bread from nearby bakeries mixed with the usual stench of the galley, sounds of normal life. Children laughing, merchants haggling, church bells ringing, drifted down to men who had almost forgotten such things existed. Local people sometimes gathered near the docked galleys out of curiosity. Most stayed well back from the fearsome warships, but a few brave souls ventured closer. These visitors brought something more valuable than gold: news from the outside world. Well, news traveled in the strangest ways. A fisherman's wife might toss an apple core toward the ship. A curious child could drop a piece of stale bread through the rowing ports. These weren't acts of organized charity. They were spontaneous moments of human connection that pierced through the brutal routine of galley life. The guards usually tried to prevent such interactions, but they couldn't watch everything all the time. Quick conversations happened through the rowing ports when officers weren't looking. A local trader might whisper news about a recent battle. Someone from a nearby village could mention which armies were moving where. Information about prisoner exchanges spread faster than wildfire among the benches. Rumors became currency among the slaves. A whispered story about successful escapes could keep hope alive for weeks. News that certain cities had fallen might mean families were safe or in danger. Every scrap of information got analyzed, discussed, and passed from bench to bench during the long hours of darkness. Then there were the other ships. Busy harbors meant dozens of vessels coming and going. Each one represented possibilities. Some carried news from distant lands, others might hold prisoners destined for exchange. The sight of merchant ships reminded everyone that free men still sailed the seas by choice, not chains. Religious visitors occasionally appeared at the docks. Priests or monks sometimes received permission to board and conduct brief services. These encounters brought mixed feelings. Some slaves welcomed any break from routine, even forced religious ceremonies. Others resented being treated like animals who needed spiritual guidance rather than freedom. But here's where things got complicated. Local officials sometimes inspected the galleys, checking on conditions or counting prisoners. These visits created tension throughout the ship. Guards became more watchful. Officers cleaned up the worst evidence of cruelty. Everyone knew that appearances mattered when important people came aboard. The inspections rarely led to improvements, though. Officials generally cared more about the ship's fighting capacity than the welfare of its rowers. A galley with healthy, well-fed slaves could row faster and fight longer. That practical concern occasionally resulted in slightly better food or medical attention, but only when absolutely necessary for ship performance. Letters sometimes made their way aboard through various channels. A sympathetic priest might carry messages. Corrupt guards could be bribed to deliver news from families. These communications were incredibly rare, but when they happened, they spread hope throughout the entire ship. Knowing that someone on the outside still cared made the unbearable slightly more bearable. Young boys from port towns occasionally threw stones at the galley slaves, treating them like caged animals in a cruel exhibition. These incidents stung worse than physical beatings. Being mocked by children who should have shown natural sympathy reminded the prisoners how far they had fallen in society's eyes. Some ports offered opportunities for the slaves to see other galleys. Comparing their conditions to those on nearby ships became a grim form of entertainment. Which captain seemed more brutal? Which crew looked better fed? These observations provided perspective on their own situation, though rarely comfort. The most precious visitors were former slaves who had somehow gained their freedom. These men understood exactly what life was like chained to the oars. When they appeared at ports, they sometimes managed to pass along encouragement or practical advice. Their very existence proved that survival and eventual freedom remained possible, even if unlikely. Shore leave occasionally allowed trusted slaves to venture onto the docks under heavy guard. These brief tastes of solid ground felt like miraculous gifts. The sensation of walking freely, even in chains, reminded their bodies what normal movement felt like. Fresh air and sunlight became treasures to store in memory during the dark months ahead. But every visit from the outside world eventually ended. Ships had schedules to keep, battles needed to be fought. The brief windows into normal human society always slammed shut, leaving the rowers to return to their endless routine. These glimpses of the outside world served a darker purpose too. They reminded everyone exactly what they had lost and might never see again. Sometimes ignorance would have been kinder than knowledge. Yet even the cruelest reminders of freedom carried something that kept men alive through impossible circumstances. The connections made during port visits created networks of information that would prove crucial when desperate moments demanded desperate measures. Most galley slaves never fought back. They sat chained to their benches day after day, accepting their fate with broken spirits. But some refused to give up. These men plotted in whispers during the darkest hours of night, their voices barely audible over the creaking of the ship's wooden hull. Planning a rebellion on a galley was like trying to organize a riot in a coffin. Every slave was chained at the ankles, sometimes around the waist too. Guards patrolled constantly with whips and clubs. The overseers knew exactly how many men sat at each bench, what they looked like, and who might cause trouble. Escape seemed impossible, yet desperate men still tried. The most common form of resistance wasn't dramatic uprisings with sword fights and battle cries. No, it was much quieter than that. A slave might deliberately row out of rhythm to slow the ship. Another might accidentally drop his oar overboard during a critical moment. Some pretended to be sicker than they actually were, forcing other rowers to work harder. These tiny acts of defiance felt huge to men who had lost everything else. Then there were the secret signals. Slaves developed ways to communicate without speaking. A certain way of positioning hands on the oar might mean trouble ahead. Scratching the left shoulder could warn others that guards were approaching. Coughing twice might signal that someone was planning something dangerous. These codes took weeks to develop and spread throughout the rowing benches. But what about real mutinies? They happened, though rarely succeeded. The most famous attempts usually began when ships docked in friendly ports or during fierce battles when guards were distracted. Slaves would try to overpower the nearest overseer, steal his keys and free their fellow prisoners. The plan always sounded simple in whispered conversations, but reality proved much harsher. Most rebellion attempts failed within minutes. Guards carried not just whips but swords and pistols too. They were trained fighters, while the slaves were weakened by poor food, little sleep, and months or years of backbreaking labor. Even if a few slaves managed to break free from their chains, they still faced dozens of armed crew members on a ship surrounded by open ocean. The punishments for attempted rebellion made the daily misery seem gentle by comparison. Ringleaders were often beaten to death in front of the other slaves as a warning. Some had their hands chopped off. Others were thrown overboard while still chained, left to drown slowly as the ship sailed away. The captain wanted every remaining slave to understand exactly what happened to troublemakers. Well, despite these horrific consequences, some slaves kept trying anyway. Why would anyone risk such terrible punishment? Because living chained to an oar wasn't really living at all. Death might be preferable to spending decades pulling a heavy wooden paddle under the Mediterranean sun. For these men, rebellion offered the only chance at dignity, even if it meant dying in the attempt. Successful escapes were incredibly rare, but they did happen occasionally. During one famous incident in 1571, several dozen galley slaves broke free during the chaos of the Battle of Lepanto. While Christian and Ottoman fleets fired cannons at each other, some prisoners managed to slip their chains and dive overboard. A few actually made it to shore and disappeared into the crowd of a busy port city. Let's not forget that rebellion sometimes came from unexpected sources. Slaves who had been model prisoners for months might suddenly snap and attack a guard. Others who seemed completely broken would reveal they had been secretly planning an escape all along. The constant stress and hopelessness could make even the most peaceful men violent and unpredictable. The threat of rebellion kept ship captains constantly worried. They knew that desperate men with nothing left to lose could be extremely dangerous, even while chained. Guards were instructed never to get too close to the rowing benches unless absolutely necessary. Keys were kept far from reaching distance. Weapons were always loaded and ready. Some slaves found subtler ways to resist. They would teach younger prisoners songs from their homeland, keeping cultural memories alive despite their captivity. Others shared stories of their families or villages, refusing to let their old lives be completely forgotten. Religious prisoners might lead quiet prayers, giving hope to men who had almost given up entirely. And the weird part is that sometimes rebellion succeeded not through violence but through unexpected alliances. A few slaves earned the trust of sympathetic crew members who helped them escape during port visits. Others convinced wealthy passengers to pay for their freedom. Occasionally, a slave's family back home managed to scrape together enough money for ransom, though this was extremely rare. These small acts of resistance and occasional dramatic escape attempts created an atmosphere of constant tension aboard every galley. Guards stayed alert, captains remained suspicious, and slaves whispered their desperate plans into the darkness. But what happened when kindness appeared in this world of cruelty? Life on a galley was brutal beyond description. But every once in a while, something unexpected happened. A guard would show mercy. An overseer would look the other way. Someone would share their meager ration. These moments were so rare that slaves remembered them for years, sometimes decades. They became treasured memories in an ocean of suffering. Giuseppe, chained to bench 14 for 3 years, never forgot the morning when the commite noticed his infected hand. Instead of ignoring it or adding extra lashes for weakness, the man actually brought him a small cloth soaked in wine. "Clean it," he whispered. "Don't let the others see." Such kindness was almost unheard of. Giuseppe's hand healed, and he survived another 2 years before finally gaining his freedom. Then there were the overseers, who secretly passed extra bread to the weakest rowers. This wasn't official policy. Quite the opposite. Guards were supposed to maintain strict discipline and equal misery for all. But some couldn't watch men slowly starve to death without doing something. They'd slip a crust of bread under a leg iron or drop it near a slave's feet during their rounds. The recipients knew better than to thank them openly. A simple nod was enough. Weather brought its own strange mercies. During scorching summer days when the sun turned the deck into a furnace, some captains actually ordered canvas stretched overhead to provide shade for the rowers. This wasn't pure kindness. Dead slaves couldn't row, but it felt like a gift from heaven to men who had been baking in the heat. Rain, usually a misery that soaked everyone to the bone, occasionally brought relief from the stifling air below deck. Medical attention was almost non-existent on galleys, but desperate situations sometimes changed the rules. When dysentery swept through the benches, killing rowers faster than they could be replaced, some ships' doctors actually treated the slaves instead of letting them die. They distributed what little medicine they had and tried to stop the spread of disease. Makes sense, right? A ship full of corpses couldn't fight battles or transport cargo. Language barriers usually created mistrust and isolation among the rowers, but sometimes they led to unexpected connections. Marco, an Italian fisherman, found himself chained next to Hassan, a Moroccan trader. Neither spoke the other's language, but Marco was dying of fever. Hassan had learned basic medical knowledge from his father. Using gestures and broken Latin, Hassan taught Marco which position would help his breathing and shared his water ration. Marco survived, and they developed a friendship that transcended words. Religious differences normally meant nothing on the galleys. Suffering was universal, but occasionally they created opportunities for small kindnesses. Christian slaves sometimes received visits from local priests when ships docked in Christian ports. These priests occasionally brought small gifts, a piece of fruit, a clean cloth, or even a few coins hidden in their robes. Muslim slaves rarely got such visits, but sometimes Christian slaves would quietly share what they'd received. Shore leave, when it happened at all, offered the most significant mercy of all. Even an hour walking on solid ground felt like paradise after months chained to a bench. Some guards actually allowed trusted slaves to rest in the shade while others worked. A few even permitted quick visits to local wells for a proper wash. These moments of humanity reminded slaves that a world beyond chains still existed. Weather wasn't always an enemy either. Unexpected calm days meant no rowing, and exhausted slaves could actually rest their bleeding hands and aching backs. Some guards used these peaceful moments to allow slaves to mend their torn clothes or clean their small possessions. Others permitted quiet conversation, a luxury usually forbidden under threat of the whip. The strangest mercies came from fellow prisoners who had been promoted to minor positions. Former slaves who became trusted assistants sometimes remembered their own suffering. They'd warn newer arrivals about which guards to avoid or slip them advice about surviving their first winter. "Keep your feet moving during the night watches," they'd whisper. "Frostbite kills faster than the lash." Food, the constant source of misery, occasionally provided unexpected relief. When ships captured enemy vessels, the spoils sometimes included better provisions. For a few days, slaves might taste actual meat or fresh vegetables instead of moldy biscuits. These brief improvements in diet could mean the difference between life and death for the weakest rowers. But the greatest mercy of all was hope itself. Letters sometimes reached the galleys, carried by merchants or priests. News from home, proof that families still existed and remembered their lost sons, fathers, and brothers. These messages were read aloud in secret, shared among men who wept to hear familiar names and places. Well, these small mercies couldn't change the fundamental horror of galley slavery, but they revealed something important about human nature. Even in the darkest circumstances, compassion occasionally flickered to life. Yet, these brief moments of kindness made the return to normal brutality even harder to bear, and accidents waited around every corner to remind slaves that death was always close. Life on a galley was already dangerous enough without adding pure chance into the mix. But accidents happened constantly, and when they did, slaves chained to their benches had nowhere to run. These weren't the kind of mishaps you could laugh off later. Oars were massive things, remember? 45 feet long and heavy as tree trunks. When one of these monsters snapped under pressure, it didn't just break quietly. The wooden shaft would crack with a sound like thunder, sending splinters flying in every direction. Sharp fragments could slice through skin like knives. Sometimes the broken end would whip backward, smashing into the faces or chests of the men behind it. The really nasty part: the slaves couldn't duck or dodge. Chained ankle to bench meant you took whatever came your way. A broken oar might knock out teeth, break ribs, or leave permanent scars across a man's face. The unlucky ones lost eyes to flying splinters. Then there were the fires. Galleys carried pitch, tar, gunpowder, and oil for various purposes, all highly flammable. One carelessly placed lantern or a spark from the ship's kitchen could turn the entire vessel into a floating inferno. Fire spreads fast on wooden ships, and the thick smoke would pour down into the rowing areas where the slaves sat trapped. Picture trying to breathe through choking black smoke while flames crackle overhead. Your chains won't budge. Other slaves around you are coughing and panicking. The guards might unlock a few men to help fight the fire, but most would be left to hope the flames didn't reach them. Many galley slaves died from smoke before the fire ever touched them. Cargo accidents were another constant threat. Ships carried heavy supplies, barrels of water, sacks of grain, cannons, spare anchors. These items were stored above the rowing decks, and ropes could snap without warning. A 200-pound barrel falling from overhead could crush a man instantly. There wasn't time to scream. The weird part is how quickly everyone just moved on afterward. Dead slaves were unchained and tossed overboard within hours. New men took their spots on the blood-stained benches. The oars kept moving like nothing had happened. Weather created its own set of deadly surprises. During storms, waves would crash over the sides, flooding the lower decks where slaves sat chained. Some men drowned in just a few feet of water because they couldn't stand up or move to higher ground. Lightning strikes could split the main mast, sending huge wooden beams crashing down onto the rowing areas below. Let's not forget about the ship's own weapons turning dangerous. Cannons could break loose from their moorings during rough seas, rolling back and forth across the deck like giant bowling balls. These things weighed tons. If one rolled into the rowing area, it would crush anyone in its path. The chains that were meant to keep slaves secure became death traps when accidents struck. Medical emergencies often turned fatal due to the conditions. A simple cut could become infected in the filthy environment. Food poisoning from rotten supplies could kill dozens of men at once. Heart attacks from overwork were common, but chained men sometimes died sitting upright and weren't discovered for hours. Even routine maintenance created hazards. When crews repaired the hull or cleaned the ship, tools and materials would fall through gaps in the deck planking. Hammers, nails, buckets of hot tar, all of it rained down on the slaves below. A drop chisel could split someone's skull open. The most terrifying accidents involved other ships. Collisions happened more often than you'd think, especially in crowded harbors or during foggy weather. When two galleys crashed into each other, the impact could snap oars like twigs, sending the broken ends flying in all directions. The force of collision sometimes broke chains, but not in a good way. Men were often thrown violently against their benches, breaking bones and necks. Navigation errors led to disasters too. Running aground on hidden rocks could punch holes in the ship's bottom. As water poured in, slaves in the lower areas found themselves trapped in a rapidly filling chamber. The panic was horrible to witness. Dozens of men struggling against their chains as the water rose around them. But here's what made accidents particularly cruel on galley ships. They interrupted nothing. The schedule didn't change. Other slaves kept rowing while bodies were cleared away. The rhythm never stopped. Accidents were just another part of daily life, like bad food or beatings from guards. These random tragedies wore down morale in ways that regular punishments couldn't. At least with punishment, you knew why it was happening. Accidents reminded everyone how completely powerless they were. While accidents brought sudden death and injury, the legal system that put these men in chains operated by completely different rules. When you're chained to an oar in the middle of the Mediterranean, legal rights become a pretty meaningless concept. Most galley slaves had about as many rights as the wooden bench they were shackled to. 0. The harsh reality. Once you were sentenced to the galleys, you essentially ceased to exist as a person in the eyes of the law. Your name got scratched off any official records back home. Your property was seized. Your family was told you were dead, which wasn't far from the truth. The legal system had basically fed you to the sea monsters and washed its hands of you. But here's where it gets interesting. Not all galley sentences were created equal. Some unlucky souls were condemned for life, which usually meant until they died at the oar within a few years. Others received specific terms, 5 years, 10 years or 20 years of rowing. The lucky ones might only get 2 or 3 years, though lucky is a relative term when you're talking about galley slavery. Criminal sentences varied wildly depending on your crime and which country had grabbed you. Murder or treason. That's a life sentence. No questions asked. Theft or desertion from the army. Maybe 5 to 10 years if the judge was feeling generous. Religious crimes could land you anywhere from a few years to permanent residence at the oar, depending on how badly you'd offended the local church authorities. Then there were the prisoners of war, who technically weren't criminals at all. These men had no sentence. They were just property now. Their fate depended entirely on diplomatic relations between their home country and their captors. Sometimes prisoner exchanges happened during peace negotiations, but you couldn't count on it. Wars dragged on for decades, and politics moved slower than a rowing galley in calm seas. The wealthy had one escape route that others didn't: ransom. Rich families could buy their relatives' freedom, but the prices were astronomical. We're talking about the equivalent of buying a house, or several houses. Ship captains weren't stupid. They knew exactly how much desperate families would pay to get their loved ones back. The going rate for a healthy young man could feed a village for months. Some slaves tried to buy their own freedom by saving money from odd jobs during shore leave, but this was almost impossible. Where exactly were you supposed to get money when you spent your days chained to a bench? Or few managed to earn coins by mending clothes for other sailors or carving trinkets to sell in port, but it would take decades to save enough for ransom. Most died long before they could afford their freedom. Here's the twisted part. Even if you completed your sentence, freedom wasn't guaranteed. Ship captains had grown attached to experienced rowers and sometimes just ignored release dates. What was an ex-slave going to do about it? File a complaint with the maritime court. Your paperwork was probably at the bottom of the ocean anyway. The legal system offered a few bizarre loopholes that almost never worked in practice. Slaves who converted to their captor's religion sometimes received reduced sentences. Christians who became Muslim, or Muslims who became Christian, might shave off a year or two. But conversion meant abandoning everything you'd believed in, and most overseers assumed you were faking it anyway. Military galleys had slightly different rules than merchant vessels. Naval slaves were technically property of the state, which meant their treatment was regulated by official naval codes. This didn't make life much better, but it did mean that captains couldn't just sell you to the highest bidder on a whim. Small comfort when you're still chained to an oar, but rules were rules. Some countries had laws about releasing slaves during certain religious holidays or royal celebrations. A new king's coronation might free a handful of galley slaves as a gesture of mercy. These releases were rare and usually only applied to the youngest or oldest slaves, the ones least valuable as rowers. The paperwork surrounding galley slavery was surprisingly detailed for something so brutal. Ships kept careful records of each slave's origin, sentence length and behavior. These documents were supposed to ensure proper release dates were honored, but record-keeping got sloppy during long voyages. Amazing how many important papers got lost when a slave's sentence was nearly up. Legal appeals were theoretically possible, but practically useless. Who was going to represent a galley slave in court? Where would the money for legal fees come from? By the time any appeal worked its way through the system, the slave in question had usually died at his oar. The whole legal framework around galley slavery was designed to be a one-way street, easy to get in, nearly impossible to get out. But even in this hopeless system, unexpected things sometimes happened that changed everything. Small accidents of fate that nobody could have predicted. In the endless darkness between rowing shifts, something remarkable happened. The human mind refused to surrender completely. While chains held bodies prisoner, thoughts wandered freely across oceans and years, carrying men back to places that felt more like fairy tales than memories. Antonio remembered his mother's hands kneading bread every morning before sunrise. The smell of yeast and flour seemed so real he could almost taste it. Strange how a scent could survive when everything else had been stripped away. His village bakery felt closer than the wooden bench beneath him, more real than the salt spray hitting his face. The mind plays tricks when survival depends on it. Dreams became refuge. Some men spent entire rowing sessions mentally walking through their childhood homes, room by room, touching familiar objects that no longer existed. Giovanni traced every stone in his father's vineyard during the brutal afternoon shifts. Each grapevine mapped in perfect detail, each harvest season replayed like a comfortable song. But here's what nobody expected about galley slave dreams. They weren't always about the past. Many men built elaborate fantasies about their future freedom. These weren't simple wishes, they were detailed architectural plans for lives that might never happen. Francesco had designed an entire cottage in his mind, complete with garden layouts and furniture placement. He knew exactly where he'd put his bed, which window would catch morning light, how many chickens he'd raise. During the worst beatings, he'd mentally hang curtains or plant imaginary vegetables. The more painful reality became, the more detailed his dream house grew. Then there were the revenge fantasies. Well, let's be honest about human nature. Not every slave dreamed of peaceful cottages and loving reunions. Some spent their mental energy planning elaborate payback against their captors. These dark dreams provided their own twisted comfort. Miguel had mentally killed his overseer 1,000 different ways, each more creative than the last. Disturbing, absolutely, but surprisingly effective for maintaining sanity. Language became another escape route. Multilingual slaves taught each other words in whispered exchanges. Paulo learned Arabic phrases from the North African prisoners. Hassan picked up Italian curses from the Europeans. These secret vocabulary lessons felt like tiny rebellions against the system trying to erase their identities. The weird part is how memories changed over time. Early in captivity, men remembered recent events with crystal clarity. They could recall exactly what they wore the day of capture, what they ate for breakfast, which neighbor waved goodbye. But as months turned to years, recent memories faded while childhood recollections grew impossibly vivid. Old songs became mental lifelines, lullabies their mothers sang, drinking songs from village festivals, religious hymns learned in childhood. The tunes played endlessly in their heads during rowing, creating private concerts that drowned out the sound of chains and whips. Music couldn't be stolen or broken. It traveled wherever the mind wandered. Some slaves developed photographic recall for faces. They'd spend hours mentally reviewing every person they'd ever known, studying remembered features like precious paintings. Brothers, sisters, friends, neighbors, even people they'd barely spoken to became important mental companions. The barber who cut their hair, the woman who sold cheese at market. Memory elevated strangers to beloved status. Dreams about food rivaled dreams about freedom. Elaborate mental feasts featuring dishes from home. The taste of fresh bread, wine from specific vineyards, cheese aged in familiar caves. These food fantasies became so detailed that some men could almost feel satisfied after imagining a complete meal. The brain compensated for what the body couldn't have. Religious memories provided another escape hatch. Even men who'd rarely attended church before captivity found comfort in half-remembered prayers and ceremonies. Christmas masses, Easter celebrations, wedding feasts, these spiritual memories felt especially powerful during the darkest moments. Faith became portable in ways they'd never understood before. But memories had cruel edges too. Some recollections brought more pain than comfort. Faces of children who'd grow up without fathers, wives who might remarry thinking their husbands were dead, farms that would fall into ruin without care. These painful memories haunted sleep and made waking almost welcome. The most successful mental survivors learned to edit their memories like skilled storytellers. They kept the warming parts and discarded the rest. Grandfather's stories but not his funeral. Wedding celebrations but not family arguments. This selective remembering required practice, but it kept hope alive when reality offered nothing but suffering. Letters never sent became elaborate mental compositions. Messages to loved ones grew longer and more detailed over time. Explanations of what happened, promises to return, expressions of love that would never be delivered. Some men spent years perfecting these phantom letters, polishing every word until they became mental masterpieces. As chains grew heavier and bodies weaker, these internal worlds became more essential than physical survival. Dreams sustained what food couldn't. Memories nourished what water couldn't reach. The mind's ability to transcend circumstances proved stronger than any shackle. But even the most elaborate mental escapes faced a terrible enemy. Time itself slowly eroded the sharpest memories, leaving slaves to wonder which dreams they could still trust. Death came fast on the galleys. One moment you'd be pulling your oar next to someone, hearing their labored breathing and quiet groans. The next morning they'd be slumped over their chains, eyes vacant and staring at nothing. The body would stay there for hours sometimes, still chained to the bench while the rest of the crew kept rowing. Nobody made a fuss about it. Death was just another part of the daily routine, like the morning ration of stale bread or the crack of the overseer's whip. The guards would eventually notice, usually when the smell got too strong or when the dead man's rowing partners couldn't keep up the rhythm anymore. They'd unlock the chains with the same casual efficiency they used for everything else. Then came the disposal. No fancy ceremonies or respectful burials here. The corpse got dragged to the side of the ship and tossed overboard like garbage. Sometimes they'd wait until nightfall to avoid attracting attention from other vessels, but often they couldn't be bothered. Splash, and that was it. Years of someone's life, their hopes and memories and dreams, all disappearing beneath the waves in seconds. The other slaves learned not to watch. What was the point? You'd seen it happen dozens of times already, and you'd probably see it dozens more before your own turn came. Makes sense, right? Why torture yourself watching something you couldn't prevent or change? But here's the twisted part. There was almost a sense of relief when someone died, not because anyone wanted their fellow slaves to suffer, but because death meant freedom. The only real freedom any of them could expect. No more chains, no more whips, no more endless hours pulling those massive oars until your hands bled and your back screamed in agony. The dead man's spot on the bench rarely stayed empty for long. New slaves arrived regularly, either captured in raids or transferred from other ships. They'd get chained to the same bench where someone had just died, often within hours. The cycle never stopped. Fresh bodies to replace the broken ones, like replacing a worn-out piece of equipment. Sometimes the veterans would whisper warnings to the newcomers about which benches were unlucky. Superstitious nonsense, mostly, but when you're living in hell, you grab onto any small comfort you can find. 3 men died on that bench this month. They'd mutter, "Stay away from the one near the mast, it's cursed." Disease killed more slaves than anything else. Packed together in filthy conditions with no medical care, infections spread like wildfire. A simple cut could turn deadly within days. Dysentery was a constant threat, leaving men weak and dehydrated. Fever could burn through the lower decks, claiming victim after victim. The overseers showed no mercy to the sick. Can't row because you're burning up with fever. Too bad, the whip would keep you moving until you collapsed completely. They'd rather work a man to death than lose a day's rowing. After all, replacing a dead slave cost less than feeding a sick one who couldn't work. Winter brought its own dangers. The cold, damp air below deck created perfect conditions for lung disease. Men would develop terrible coughs that never went away, slowly drowning in their own fluids. Others simply couldn't handle the combination of cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Their bodies just gave up. Then there were the accidents. Heavy oars could break suddenly, sending splinters flying or crushing anyone in the way. Cargo sometimes shifted during rough weather, crushing slaves who couldn't move out of the way because of their chains. Fires occasionally broke out, and chained men had no way to escape the flames. The worst deaths happened during battles. Cannonballs would tear through the lower decks, where the rowers sat chained and helpless. Some men lingered for hours with terrible wounds, begging for help that never came. Others were killed instantly. Probably the luckier ones, all things considered. What really got to the surviving slaves wasn't just the death itself, but how quickly everyone moved on. Your rowing partner of 2 years dies next to you, and within an hour someone new is sitting in his spot. No mourning period, no moment of silence, no acknowledgement that a human being had just ceased to exist. A few slaves tried to hold on to some dignity in death. They'd whisper prayers over their dead companions when the guards weren't watching. Sometimes they'd try to remember the deceased person's real name, not just the number the overseers used. Small gestures, but important ones for maintaining their humanity in an inhuman situation. The strange thing was how death became almost routine. New slaves would be horrified the first time they watched a corpse get thrown overboard, but after months or years at the oars, they'd barely glance up when it happened. You had to protect yourself emotionally somehow. Of course, not every slave accepted death passively. Some held on to hope that freedom might come through other means. Freedom from a galley was about as likely as finding a unicorn in your backyard. But it did happen, not often, and rarely in the ways you might expect. The most dramatic escapes happened during the chaos of battle. When cannonballs were flying and ships were ramming into each other, sometimes the impossible became possible. A lucky hit might shatter the chain holding a slave to his bench, or guards might get distracted long enough for someone to slip away in the smoke and confusion. One famous case involved a Spanish galley that caught fire during a fight with Barbary pirates. In all the panic to abandon ship, 3 chained slaves somehow broke free and jumped overboard. They made it to shore and disappeared into the countryside. The authorities never found them. Storms offered another slim chance at freedom. When a galley was fighting for its life against massive waves, crew members had bigger problems than watching every single slave. Some prisoners managed to break their weakened chains during these terrifying moments. The irony, they had to survive the very storm that gave them their opportunity. Most didn't make it. Drowning while free was still drowning. Then there were the prisoner exchanges. These happened more often than you might think, but they worked like a complicated chess game between governments. A Christian nation might trade 50 Muslim galley slaves for 50 of their own people held in North African ports. The negotiations could take months or even years. Families back home rarely knew if their loved ones were even alive, let alone part of some diplomatic deal brewing in distant capitals. Some slaves got lucky through random acts of mercy. A captain might free an old prisoner who was too weak to row anymore. Or a wealthy merchant might buy someone's freedom as a religious gesture during a holy festival. These moments were unpredictable and rare, but they kept hope alive on the benches. The ransom system was probably the most organized path to freedom, though it mainly helped Christians enslaved by Muslim galley fleets. Religious orders like the Mercedarians and Trinitarians actually specialized in collecting money to buy back Christian slaves. They'd send agents to North African ports with bags of coins haggling over human lives like they were buying livestock. The process was expensive and slow, but it worked. Between 1575 and 1769, these religious orders freed over 70,000 Christian captives. That's an impressive number, but remember, hundreds of thousands never made it home. Wealthy families sometimes mortgaged everything they owned to ransom a son or husband. Others sold their land, their businesses, even their homes. The prices were deliberately high. A strong young rower might cost more than a working farm. Galley owners knew exactly how much families were willing to pay. But here's the weird part. Some slaves didn't want to be ransomed. After years or decades at the oars, they'd given up hope of rescue. When freedom finally came, they felt terrified rather than grateful. The outside world had changed. Their families might be dead or remarried. They had no money, no job skills except rowing, and bodies broken by years of brutal labor. Some actually asked to stay on the galley as paid crew members rather than face the unknown. The lucky ones who did make it back to their old lives faced enormous challenges. Imagine trying to explain 20 years of slavery to people who'd never left their village. Former galley slaves often couldn't do heavy work anymore. Their hands were permanently deformed from gripping oars. Their backs were bent from years of rowing while chained. Many had scars covering their bodies from whippings and accidents. Some turned their suffering into purpose. They became advocates for other prisoners, working with religious orders or wealthy donors to organize more ransoms. Others shared their stories as warnings, traveling from town to town describing the horrors of galley slavery. A few even wrote books about their experiences, though most couldn't read or write. The psychological scars ran deeper than the physical ones. Former slaves often jumped at loud noises, thinking they were about to be whipped. They hoarded food, unable to believe they'd get regular meals. Sleep came hard after years of trying to rest while chained upright. Many never fully recovered from what we'd now recognize as severe trauma. Despite everything they'd endured, these survivors carried something powerful with them, proof that escape was possible. Their mere existence gave hope to the thousands still chained to oars across the Mediterranean. Stories of their freedom spread from bench to bench, port to port, keeping alive the dream that someone somewhere might be working to bring others home. Yet for every tale of successful escape or ransom, there were countless stories that ended differently. The vast majority of galley slaves died at their oars, never seeing freedom again. Those who did escape represented just a tiny fraction of the hundreds of thousands who suffered this fate. But even the smallest chance was better than none at all. For those few galley slaves who somehow survived years of hell and made it back to freedom, the real nightmare was just beginning. Their bodies were destroyed, their minds were shattered, and society wasn't exactly throwing welcome back parties. Most former slaves looked like walking skeletons when they finally stumbled off those ships. Years of sitting hunched over an oar had permanently curved their spines. Their hands were twisted claws, fingers locked in the shape of oar handles they could never quite release. Scars from whips crisscrossed their backs like a roadmap of pain. Some were missing eyes, ears, or chunks of flesh from battles they'd been forced to row through. But here's the cruel twist. Physical injuries were nothing compared to what happened inside their heads. These men had spent years in constant terror, never knowing when the next lash would fall or when a storm might send them to the bottom of the sea. They'd watched hundreds of men die right next to them. The smell of death, sweat, and human waste was burned into their memories forever. Many couldn't sleep in beds anymore. After years of sleeping sitting up, chained to a bench, lying flat felt wrong and terrifying. They'd wake up screaming, thinking they were still at the oars. Some couldn't stand being inside buildings too much like the cramped, suffocating galley decks where they'd suffered for so long. Then there was the matter of finding work. Who wanted to hire a broken-down ex-slave who jumped at loud noises and couldn't straighten his back? These men had no skills except rowing, and trust me, there wasn't much demand for professional rowers in regular society. Most employers took one look at these scarred, trembling wrecks and sent them away. The lucky ones might find work as beggars outside churches, telling their horror stories for a few coins. Some became street preachers, warning others about the evils they'd witnessed. A handful managed to get jobs in monasteries, where monks sometimes took pity on their suffering. But even these fortunate survivors lived in crushing poverty. Let's not forget the families they'd left behind. Many had been gone for 10, 15, even 20 years. Their wives had remarried, thinking them dead. Their children had grown up without fathers, and didn't recognize these broken strangers who claimed to be their dads. Properties had been sold, houses occupied by others, entire lives erased and rebuilt without them. Some returning slaves discovered their families had spent everything trying to ransom them, only to fail. Imagine the guilt moaning your loved ones had beggared themselves for nothing while you suffered anyway. Many couldn't handle it, and simply disappeared into the streets rather than burden their families further. The worst part, nobody really wanted to hear their stories. These tales of systematic brutality made people uncomfortable. Society preferred to pretend galley slavery was just a fact of life, not something worth getting upset about. Former slaves quickly learned to keep their mouths shut about what they'd endured. But a few brave souls refused to stay quiet. They told anyone who'd listen about the horrors they'd witnessed. Some even wrote letters to authorities, describing the conditions and begging for reforms. Most of these complaints were ignored, but occasionally they planted seeds that would later grow into actual change. Religious organizations sometimes helped, but even their charity came with strings attached. Former slaves had to prove their faith, attend endless services, and submit to moral lectures about forgiveness and redemption. Hard to forgive when your back still screams from old whip marks every morning. The weird part is how some survivors actually missed aspects of galley life. Not the brutality or suffering, obviously, but the strange camaraderie that developed among men facing death together. On the outside, they were alone with their trauma. At least on the galleys, everyone understood exactly what you were going through. Medical care was practically non-existent. Doctors had no idea how to treat the complex injuries and psychological damage these men carried. Broken bones had healed wrong, infections had become permanent disabilities, and the mental wounds were completely invisible to everyone except those who bore them. A handful of former slaves managed to rebuild their lives completely. They found new trades, started fresh families, and created something resembling normal existence. These success stories became legend among other survivors, proof that escape from the past was possible, even if unlikely. Most, however, died within a few years of gaining freedom. Their bodies, pushed beyond human limits for so long, simply gave out. Diseases they'd picked up in the filthy galley conditions finally caught up with them. Some died from injuries that had never properly healed. The legacy of galley slavery lived on in the broken bodies and shattered minds of these survivors. They were living proof of humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty, walking reminders of a system built on human suffering. Their stories reveal the true cost of galley slavery, that lasted long after the chains were finally removed.